Quote, "Every nation is put to shame if one points out such a wonderfully idealized company of philosophers as that of the early Greek masters, Thales, Anaximander, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Anaxagoras, Empedocles, Democritus, and Socrates. All those men are integral, entire, and self-contained, and hewn out of one stone. Severe necessity exists between their thinking and their character. They are not bound by any convention, because at that time no professional class of philosophers and scholars existed. They all stand before us in magnificent solitude as the only ones who then devoted their life exclusively to knowledge." End quote. Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks is one of the more obscure texts in Friedrich Nietzsche's corpus. There are many good reasons for this. It is unfinished and ends abruptly. It was never published, and it concerns subject matter that is not as immediately accessible as Nietzsche's more popular writings. You will not find his major concepts in this work, such as the will to power or the critique of metaphysics, except insofar as those ideas appear in the background, inchoate, unnamed, not yet fully formed in Nietzsche's thought. In Nietzsche's interpretation of these pre-Platonic philosophers of ancient Greece, we find the starting place for his later philosophical career. The inspiration for many of those great ideas that we mentioned can arguably be found in his exegesis of these extraordinary figures from the Hellenic world from the 6th through the 4th century BC. Nietzsche wrote this essay in the years 1873 and 1874, while he was still an academic studying classical philology at Basel. Notably, he'd already written his Birth of Tragedy by this time, but that book was not intended as a work of philosophy. Admittedly, one of the main criticisms of Birth of Tragedy at the time of its publication was that it departed significantly from philological rigor. Nietzsche lapses into Schopenhauerian philosophy in that book, at other times into adoration for Wagner, but nevertheless, it must be said, Birth of Tragedy is not a work of pure philosophy. That was not Nietzsche's goal in writing it. He did set out to write a text in the field of philology. However, the project in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks is somewhat similar to Birth of Tragedy, insofar as in that book Nietzsche had looked to the Greeks as a counterpoint to modern society, used the exploration of their art, the Greek dramatic tragedy, and the values behind it as a means of understanding art itself, and for that matter, understanding valuing itself. Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks is much the same in this method, only that instead of Greek drama, the topic is Greek philosophy. Nietzsche set the question to himself as to how it was that philosophy came to be in the Greek world. But Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks is a rather different book from Birth of Tragedy, in that it is not a work of philology. It comes out of his study of philology, but Nietzsche is really engaging with the philosophical ideas as these figures put them forward. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you already know the phrase pre-Platonic, but if you haven't heard that phrase before or you need a refresher, Nietzsche comes up with this term to replace the label pre-Socratic. Nietzsche's argument is that Socrates has more in common with these figures, usually called pre-Socratic, than he does with his own student, Plato. The point of this terminology is to include Socrates among these earlier figures, but it is also to divide him from Plato. The main reason for this is that Socrates is one of these single-minded sages, as Nietzsche calls them. Like the other pre-Platonics, he is hewn from a single stone, whereas Plato is a systematizer who borrows from multiple philosophers. Plato's thought and also his character is a mix of multiple types that came before him, rather than an original expression of one coherent spirit, in Nietzsche's view. Quote, "As a man, too, Plato mingles the features of the royally secluded, all-sufficing Heraclitus, of the melancholy, compassionate, and legislatory Pythagoras, and of the psycho-expert dialectician Socrates. All later philosophers are such hybrid characters. Wherever something one-sided does come into prominence with them, as in the case of the Cynics, it is not a type, but a caricature." End quote. Nietzsche argues that when we come into contact with a single-minded philosophy, we are confronted with something which is considered somewhat absurd from the standpoint of our modern world. That which survives over the ages is, whether we like it or not, dependent on the zeitgeist, the movement of the collective mind, and what the multitude considers relevant in a given time and place. Nietzsche suggests, for example, that Schopenhauer's magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, has been rendered waste paper by the progressive feeling brought about by the scientific revolutions which are in full swing in Nietzsche's time. And anyone with a sense that there is a real progression and development in the course of the phenomenal world would naturally dispense with such a pessimist as Schopenhauer, who doesn't believe in progress. This is just one example, and Nietzsche suggests that we accept this state of affairs, like Goethe, who said, quote, "Let no one complain about and grumble at things vile and mean. They are the real rulers, however much this be gainsaid." End quote. In other words, the crowd and its zeitgeist is far more powerful than the truth, and philosophy has never been a course of development in which we grasp the truth more and more completely. Nietzsche's acceptance of this very state of affairs is, somewhat ironically, an appeal to the kind of anti-progressive pessimism that Nietzsche just said the mean and vulgar crowd has dispensed with. Nietzsche's saying this is an eternal, unchanging truth, that what the multitude believes never has anything to do with the philosophers' search for knowledge, their devotion of their life to knowledge. That is not what will determine what is in vogue. Nietzsche writes, this is in section 2 of Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, quote, "A time which suffers from the so-called general education, but has no culture and no unity of style in her life, hardly knows what to do with philosophy, even if the latter were proclaimed by the very genius of truth in the streets and marketplaces. She rather remains at such a time the learned monologue of the solitary rambler, the accidental booty of the individual, the hidden closet secret, or the innocuous chatter between academic senility and childhood. Nobody dare venture to fulfill in himself the law of philosophy. Nobody lives philosophically, with that simple manly faith which compelled an ancient, wherever he was, whatever he did, to deport himself as a Stoic, when he had once pledged his faith to the Stoa. All modern philosophizing is limited politically and regulated by the police to learned semblance. Thanks to governments, churches, academies, customs, fashions, and the cowardice of man, it never gets beyond the sigh, if only, or beyond the knowledge, once upon a time there was. Philosophy is without rights. Therefore, modern man, if he were at all courageous and conscientious, ought to condemn her, and perhaps banish her with words similar to those by which Plato banished the tragic poets from his state." End quote. Once again, there's an irony to Nietzsche's musings here. He's tacitly accepting the notion that modernity is anti-philosophical. It would reject such a way of thinking as that of the Pre-Platonic philosopher, who is hewn from one stone, uncompromising, a coherent, integral expression of a tyrannical idea. Philosophy has been relegated to the fringes. Modernity regards such an uncompromising attempt at rendering the world in one's own image as absurdity or insanity or even dangerous. Philosophy generally has no power over public opinion, over public institutions, and in such an age as our own that we might designate as a public age, philosophy therefore seems destined to perish. Only a facsimile of it remains among the senile academics. The public mind moves according to what is fashionable, and all that we find in philosophy is unfashionable. We could put it like that. And yet, by authoring this very work, Nietzsche is not passively accepting this state of affairs. He's in fact setting himself up against it. He's positioning himself as untimely. And it might be justified to call this work a preliminary, untimely meditation. Nietzsche's purpose in writing this work, as he explains in the preface, is that by presenting us with these remarkable figures from antiquity, we might be able to see that, quote, that mode of life, of viewing human affairs at any rate, has existed once and is therefore possible, end quote. Accordingly, when Nietzsche describes this series of thinkers, they are striking both in their difference from us and our modern ways of thinking, and in their difference from the ways of thinking that preceded them, the ways of thinking that were common in their own culture. Each such philosopher is an archetypal figure, a man who stands for one big idea. Whatever other constituent ideas may be included, they are really just further elaborations on the central idea. In this same preface, Nietzsche admits most philosophies are useful only to their creator, and to subsequent generations they just look like one big mistake. And accordingly, it's easy to dismiss the Pre-Platonics, as many have throughout history, for example, daring to make hypotheses about nature without having first bothered to invent the scientific method. But as Nietzsche would go on to argue in his later works, such as Beyond Good and Evil, we haven't changed all that much, insofar as philosophers are governed by one ruling thought. Philosophy is a confession, a revelation of who one is. The Pre-Platonics do this, but without any of the adulteration, any of the sophistication of the modern philosopher, who may have, for example, ideas about the dialectic, that the objective truth can be found through this process of logical investigation. In Nietzsche's understanding, the Pre-Platonics are more artistic in their approach. Their philosophies are a reflection of what is within them. They do not proceed by careful steps, but by great leaps. What each one of them expresses, in other words, is a will, a tendency, a type. In this sense, the only difference between us and them is that this single-mindedness is not obscured by the pretensions of a philosophical system. These men, accordingly, are, quote, strangers to us, end quote. Nietzsche writes that whoever takes any pleasure in learning about extraordinary men, however, will find pleasure in the strange thought of these figures, however erroneous we may find it to be from our modern standpoint. This is because, quote, they all have in them one point which is irrefutable, a personal touch and color. One can use them in order to form a picture of the philosopher, just as from a plant growing in a certain place, one can form conclusions as to the soil, end quote. If we recall Nietzsche's work, Birth of Tragedy, and especially the comments that he appended to that later work in his 1886 preface that he added, Nietzsche indicates that the appearance of philosophy in the Hellenic world is something of a riddle. The theoretical approach to life, represented by Socrates and Plato, this was seen as a complete inversion of the tragic way of life that came before it. Nietzsche argues in Twilight of the Idols that the Athenian noblemen were creatures of instinct, who never knew the reason for the things they did and the things they believed, and Socrates' interrogation of them, seeking for such reasons, speaks to the decline of Greek society. The very fact that their values had become questionable, Socrates is a symptom of this. The creation of philosophy seems like an odd thing when we consider the culture of the Hellenic Greeks, who considered such knowledge to be, quote, useless. That was their word for the kind of knowledge that we would class as philosophical, because it was not knowledge that one used for any art or craft. It was not knowledge of how to appease the gods through the sacrificial rites, nor was it knowledge of how to fight or win battles. Philosophical knowledge about the truth of the objective world, as we might put it in our own vocabulary, was something the Greeks were suspicious of. The tragic age of the Greeks we could place from roughly 700 BC to around the time when Socrates died, around 399. That was an age defined by the culture of tragedy. It was more broadly a period in which the Greek was instructed primarily by art and poetry. The people entrusted with teaching virtue to the Greek citizens, to impart the knowledge to them of how to live and how to act, what the gods were like, and so on, were the playwrights and the poets. Later, there was a formalized school that instructed people in rhetoric and oratory. These were called the sophists, and they represented another such cultural institution entrusted with educating the polis. So how was it that this audacious figure called the philosopher could ever arise on Greek soil? How could the man who pursues worthless knowledge carve out a place for his existence in Hellenic society? The daunting challenge of such a prospect speaks all the more strongly to the power of these philosophical ideas, and more importantly, to the power of the imposing character, the will of the figures that expounded them. Nietzsche, in his understanding of the Pre-Platonic philosophers, comes to see them as a type classed among the artists. The philosopher creates a new, unified picture of the world, but through means of concepts. He overcomes the mythic preliminary stage of philosophizing found in the theologies and cosmogonies. He overcomes the sporadic, aphoristic wisdom found in the writing of the poets and the utterances of the oracles. He goes beyond all of the natural sciences by turning his attention to metaphysics. These figures are extraordinary precisely because they create the art of philosophizing in such a resolutely unself-reflective age. An age of unreason, pride, the pitiless pursuit of worldly power. The fact that such philosophers flourished during this age makes their appearance the most noteworthy of all such appearances of philosophers throughout history, throughout the many different civilizations and different epochs of human history. This meditation on the figure of the Greek philosopher can be seen as a prefiguration of Nietzsche's later thoughts on the problem of science. This begins in earnest with Socrates, but seems to have its roots in these earlier figures. Or the role of the philosopher in a healthy society. This is the philosopher presented as a healthy figure rather than a sick figure. The very concern with sickness and health bears resemblance to Nietzsche's mature philosophy, in which health and sickness become interchangeable with strength and weakness, or with vitality and decline. The core question of philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks might be put this way. Assuming that most examples we have of philosophers are sick examples, that is to say, they arose during a sick period of civilization, what then is a healthy philosopher? What does the philosopher mean to a healthy society? Accordingly, one alternative title to the work that Nietzsche explored as an option was The Philosopher as Physician to Culture. Nietzsche is not just using the term physician in the sense of a medical doctor, someone that you see just when you're sick. When the physiology stops working, you go to the doctor. Ironically, one could say that's a sick person's view of medicine. We might consider Nietzsche's remark in his lecture on Pythagoras that, quote, the theory and practice of the physicians were considered further advancement for gymnastic trainers, end quote. The physician was seen more like a craftsman who worked on and perfected the physique. He didn't just fix it when it was broken. The physician's research, his knowledge, furthered the art of the personal trainers who produced Olympic athletes. The Greeks had made an entire social institution out of creating the ideal physique, and the knowledge of the physician was used for this purpose. And thus, even though Nietzsche didn't ultimately end up using this title, again, he didn't even publish the essay, we can still see the parallel there. The philosopher is a physician to culture, meaning that in a healthy time, the philosopher is not just the person who fixes culture when it's broken. The philosopher is the one who acquires the knowledge of what cultural health itself constitutes, and thus brings a healthy culture into greater and greater health. Nietzsche writes at the beginning of this essay, quote, whenever philosophy showed itself helping, saving, prophylactic, it was with healthy people. It made sick people still more ill. If ever a nation was disintegrated and but loosely connected with the individuals, never has philosophy bound these individuals closer to the whole. If ever an individual was willing to stand aside and plant around himself the hedge of self-sufficiency, philosophy was always ready to isolate him still more and to destroy him through isolation. She is dangerous where she is not in her full right, and it is only the health of a nation, but not that of every nation, which gives her this right. Let us now look around for the highest authority as to what constitutes the health of a nation. The Greeks, as the truly healthy nation, have justified philosophy once and for all by having philosophized, and that indeed more than all other nations." End quote. Nietzsche abandoned this essay in order to focus his efforts on a new project, critiquing David Strauss. This would become the first untimely meditation, and Nietzsche would write and publish 3 more of them. These are usually considered his first purely philosophical works. But had Nietzsche finished this essay instead, Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks likely would have been the first. And therefore, I tend to see this work as Nietzsche's first foray into philosophy, his first purely philosophical essay. As to why he did not finish it, there's a number of possibilities that we won't go into here. They mostly involve speculation. I guess the short version that we could say is that Nietzsche may have wished to take on subject matter that was entirely outside of his scholarly career as a philologist, so maybe he wanted to leave the Greeks behind as a primary subject. He might have wanted to impress the Wagners by attacking David Strauss, a figure for whom they bore some dislike. Whatever the case may be, this essay unfortunately ends after a discussion of the philosopher Anaxagoras, and it thus leaves out the final 3 figures that he mentions, Democritus, Empedocles, and Socrates. Thankfully, we have Nietzsche's lectures on the Pre-Platonic philosophers, the text of which has been assembled, translated, and published in what seems to have been a daunting undertaking all its own. Those lectures contain many of the same ideas and descriptions as appear in this essay, and Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks is clearly based, at least in part, on those lectures. Even some of the phrasing remains the same from the lecture notes to the essay. Nietzsche's focus is a bit different in the lectures, though. For one, the lectures are primarily concerned with a narrative about the emergence of scientific materialism. Nietzsche argues that this process, as it develops in Hellenic civilization, is mirrored in European Enlightenment civilization. Nietzsche draws parallels between the scientific minds of modern Europe and the Pre-Platonics, and he elucidates the thought of the Pre-Platonics by comparison with scientific experiments and new theories in physics. That is, new for Nietzsche's time. I have, in the past, called the book that Nietzsche had originally planned, based on these lectures, the most important book that Nietzsche never wrote, because so many of the underpinnings of his later ideas are in the background of those lectures. You see how he's in dialogue with the Greek philosophers, how his philosophy is in many ways a response to them. And there is a surprising importance to the philosophy of science, which is a large part of this. If you want to know more about that aspect of Nietzsche's interpretation of the Pre-Platonics, I recommend you listen to the episodes from Season 2 about that topic entitled Descent into Materialism and the World as Will to Power and Nothing Besides. Those episodes primarily cover the Pre-Platonic lectures, which should be regarded as essentially another iteration of this same project of Nietzsche's, albeit approached from a slightly different angle. Today, instead, we're going to focus on the incarnation of those ideas in the form of this essay, Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, in which his engagement with the Pre-Platonics is a bit more straightforward, philosophical. The meta-narrative concerning the development of science, it is still there, but it's more in the background, and Nietzsche's focus is primarily on representing this sequence of fascinating personalities to us. Nevertheless, since the essay is unfinished, and I do want to cover the final names that he planned to include here, we'll look to his lecture notes to fill out the descriptions of the final figures, Empedocles and Democritus. I'm not going to devote a section to Socrates here. This is not because Socrates is unimportant, but because we've already spent numerous episodes discussing Nietzsche's interpretation of Socrates. Nietzsche on Socrates would require an episode all its own, which we've already done, so including such a discussion here would not do the subject justice, and it would also be redundant. It should also be said that Nietzsche's lecture notes concern many other figures that we will not discuss. We're going to strictly concern ourselves with the names that Nietzsche lists off at the beginning of the essay. Nietzsche, I think correctly, judges those that he excludes from this essay to be merely secondary figures. They're either elaborators within the school of someone else, or significant only as the forerunner of someone else. So that we can help make sense of this procession of figures, and remember how they fit in with one another, I'd like to begin by breaking the Pre-Platonics down into categories or phases of pre-Platonic thought. Thales, Anaximander, and Heraclitus are what I would call the first cosmologists. Their primary concern is with understanding the material world and explaining the material world. They have a monistic tendency, and they believe in a rising and passing away. That is to say that things come into and go out of being. These are the three figures that we're going to talk about in this first episode. Then there are the Eleatics. The sole figure who represents them here is Parmenides. The Eleatics believe that non-being doesn't exist, that things don't arise and pass away, and that only being exists. Therefore, change is impossible, motion is impossible, and the senses are illusory. Finally, there are the pluralists, Anaxagoras, Empedocles, and Democritus, who believe not in being, but beings, plural. Multiple existence, multiple types of matter that interact and transform. The pluralists are concerned with explaining the basic principles of these interactions and transformations. So, the first cosmologists, the Eleatics, and the pluralists are the major categorizations of thought here. You could categorize them according to a different schema. These are simply my arbitrary distinctions that we're making here for the purposes of helping to better remember how these thinkers interact and relate to one another. They're not essential designations, it's just a helpful mnemonic. And so without further ado, I'll attempt to fulfill Nietzsche's purposes in this project, albeit in podcast form, of giving you a portrait of each of these significant pre-Platonic figures. We'll begin with Thales. Thales of Miletus, circa 585 BC. Thales leaves us no writings in his own hand, and we know his work only from later chroniclers who have preserved something of his thought. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Thales is that he's likely not a Greek, but a Phoenician. The Mediterranean world allowed for the intermingling of all sorts of different thinkers and doctrines as Thales studied and taught in Egypt. He is not just a philosopher, but also a scientist. Again, it has to be emphasized. The social institution of philosophy didn't exist at this time. There was not a recognizable familiar type called the philosopher, because Thales is the first such type. The chief contributions of Thales to the sciences were geometrical proofs, but his chief contribution to posterity is nothing having to do with math or science. Thales' significance is that he creates philosophy by proposing a metaphysical hypothesis. He proposes a theory about the origin and basis of the world, that all is water. Quote, Greek philosophy seems to begin with a preposterous fancy, with the proposition that water is the origin and mother womb of all things. Is it really necessary to stop there and become serious? Yes, and for three reasons. Firstly, because the proposition does enunciate something about the origin of things. Secondly, because it does so without figure and fable. Thirdly, and lastly, because in it is contained, although only in the chrysalis state, the idea. Everything is one. The first mentioned reason leaves Thales still in the company of religious and superstitious people. The second, however, takes him out of this company and shows him to us as a natural philosopher. But by virtue of the third, Thales becomes the first Greek philosopher. If he had said, "Out of water, earth is evolved," we should only have a scientific hypothesis, a false one, though nevertheless difficult to refute. But he went beyond the scientific. In his presentation of this concept of unity through the hypothesis of water, Thales has not surmounted the low level of the physical discernments of his time, but at the best overleapt them. The deficient and unorganized observations of an empiric nature which Thales had made as to the occurrence and transformations of water, or to be more exact, of the moist, would not in the least have made possible or even suggested such an immense generalization. That which drove him to this generalization was a metaphysical dogma which had its origin in a mystic intuition, and which, together with the ever-renewed endeavors to express it better, we find in all philosophies, the proposition, "Everything is one." End quote. So Thales is the first philosopher because he leads the way in the methodology of representing the unity of existence. His intuition, all is one, is at the root of all philosophy, so long as we agree with Nietzsche in classifying philosophy as a kind of art that involves the reflection of external existence in the mirror of the internal. And since our internal world, when rendered artistically, is always the work of an impulse, that means it is always ruled by a single tyrannical thought, because all such impulses want to be ruler and act tyrannically. In Thales' case, all is water. This is not a scientific hypothesis, strictly speaking, even though Thales does literally mean that all physical material we encounter is a transformation of water, or its rarefaction. But Thales attempts something metaphysical when he tries to articulate the notion that there is a substance to being, a universal reality that forms the ground of all being. The remarkable thing about Thales is that he allows his scientific drive for inquiry to manifest itself in this artistic way. The philosopher is essentially artistic because he renders an image. It is an image formed through the concept rather than set into marble, but nevertheless it is a representation that comes from the subjectivity of the philosopher. The claim, "all is water," would not stand up to empirical scrutiny. Rather, it is thinking that partakes readily of a poetic license. Nietzsche says that, quote, "What the verse is to the poet, dialectic thinking is to the philosopher. He snatches at it in order to hold fast his enchantment, in order to petrify it." End quote. Nietzsche invites us to consider an artist contemplating the waters flowing and breaking as a waterfall splashes down a mountain. Quote, "One might imagine the creating artist standing near a waterfall and seeing in the forms which leap towards him an artistically prefiguring game of the water with human and animal bodies, masks, plants, rocks, nymphs, griffins, and with all existing types in general, so that to him the proposition, 'everything is water,' is confirmed. The thought of Thales has rather its value, even after the perception of its indemonstrableness, the very fact that it was meant unmythically and unallegorically." End quote. So the important distinction between the philosopher and all the types that have come before is the fact that he does not lapse into myth and story. It is not that Thales reasons through a dispassionate logic to reach an indisputable conclusion. Rather, Thales takes a poetic leap. He overcomes the personifications, metaphors, and cosmogonies of Greek culture. He doesn't accomplish this through the sciences. In some sense, the question that Thales concerns himself with, what is the origin of all things, is not a scientific question in the first place, and the sciences cannot help him here. His answer draws upon the phenomenal world as an explanation of the phenomenal. This choice is no more or less justified than the mythological, we could say, but that's precisely why his great leap is so remarkable, in contradistinction to his time. In a culture where everyone views the origin of all things as the act of personified deities, as the work of Zeus and Apollo and Aphrodite, Thales looks to a natural phenomenon as the origin of all things. Nevertheless, we can perhaps see the logic in suggesting water as the origin, in spite of its indemonstrableness, as Nietzsche puts it, since we could easily see how, when water is absorbed by the soil, plants grow. We need water to survive. All living beings do. The oceans are teeming with life. It seems as though water is the thing from which living things spring. We can also see how wet or moist soil eventually hardens and dries. One might begin to get the notion that once there was only water, there was an undifferentiated mass of that which is moist, and then the earth dried and hardened out of it, the living things grew out of it. Even evaporation could be seen as the explanation for how the air is formed. It is heated water, and so on and so forth. And so we see in Thales a mind which is not chaotic and irrational. There's a logic to his approach. We could call it a form of artistic reasoning. There's an important sense in which the philosopher is not just a development on the scientist, he's not just a development on the religious type, and he's not, strictly speaking, just an artist. The philosopher draws on aspects of all three of these and simultaneously leaps beyond all three. He is arbitrarily creative like the artist. He follows his reason like the scientist, and he aims to encompass the whole of reality like the mythmakers. It's not easy to summarize this relationship in one sentence, but perhaps we can say the philosopher perceives, maybe even just on some intuitive or unconscious level, that what's common to all three types is a depiction of reality. And the philosopher aims to do the same thing, but in his own way, in a new way. Nietzsche writes, quote, "When Thales says everything is water, man is startled up out of his worm-like mauling of and crawling about among the individual sciences. He divines the last solution of things and masters through this divination the common perplexity of the lower grades of knowledge. The philosopher tries to make the total chord of the universe re-echo within himself, and then to project it onto ideas outside himself. Whilst he is contemplative like the creating artist, sympathetic like the religionist, looking out for ends and causalities like the scientific man, whilst he feels himself swell up to the macrocosm, he still retains the circumspection to contemplate himself coldly as the reflex of the world. He retains that cool-headedness, which the dramatic artist possesses when he transforms himself into other bodies, speaks out of them, and yet knows how to project this transformation outside himself into written verses." End quote. So, a couple of things to comment on in that passage. Again, Nietzsche speaks at length of the blending of the artistic, scientific, and religious type within the philosopher. The notion of the scientific man boring through the earth like a worm is an allegory that Nietzsche would return to time and again. In his essay on Truth and Lies in the Extra-Moral Sense, he talks of the sciences as digging in their own individual mine shafts. Science is a bringing down of one's perspective to the level of the smallest detail. The various sciences, as each discipline becomes specialized, they become concerned with smaller and smaller distinctions and nuances. To encompass the whole of reality is, in some sense, unscientific, and thus any time somebody dares to give a description of existence itself, or the universe itself, one necessarily has to go beyond the sciences and become philosophical, even as they draw upon the power of the sciences to seek out the causes and reasons for everything. It's a leap into the creative, because creative license always must be used, and that's true no matter how much science one knows or brings into their description of the world. To say, for example, "We are all molecules in motion," perhaps the kind of phrase we might hear from a modern scientific materialist. Well, that phrase singles out one level of material existence, the level of the molecule, and makes that primary. It also tables the mystery of why there's motion at all, simply asserts that motion exists as a kind of truism. And so in the statement, we are molecules in motion, we have a selective focus on one part of reality while obscuring the rest, which is an artistic choice. And so however clinical such a phrasing may sound, a poetic distortion of reality takes place in that phrasing. Further, such a statement posits motion as a brute fact. It becomes a sort of axiomatic mystery of existence. So we have an artistic claim and a religious sensibility contained in such an apparently scientific statement. Such a statement is a great leap. Thales, as preposterous as his initial assumption seems, is doing the same thing. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Thus the expression of every deep philosophical intuition by means of dialectics and scientific reflection is, it is true, on the one hand the only means to communicate what has been seen, but on the other hand it is a paltry means, and at the bottom a metaphorical, absolutely inexact translation into a different sphere and language." End quote. Considering metaphorical thinking, the metaphor of the leap to describe philosophy is particularly important in this essay. Nietzsche uses the metaphor of two men attempting to cross a river by different methods. The first man, quote, "light-footed, leaps over it using the stones and swinging himself upon them ever further and further, though they precipitously sink into the depths behind him." End quote. The second man calculates instead that he must first, quote, "build a pathway which will bear his heavy, weary step." End quote. The first man is like Thales and all the Pre-Platonics that we will discuss in this essay. The second man represents Plato and all those philosophers who come after Plato, the post-Platonics. Thales shows the way forward with his hypothesis because the whole of reality is depicted in the form of the concept, and Nietzsche understands this to be a creative, arbitrary, artistic act, rather than a dialectical movement of the mind towards a greater truth, or however a Platonist or a Hegelian philosopher might understand it. This is the significance of Thales. He's the first one of the Greek canon of writers who does this, and so in spite of the fact that there are no Thalians around today promoting the aquatic theory of material existence, in some sense we are all Thalians, to the extent that any philosopher who tries to encompass reality in an idea is following the course of Thales. To sum up this figure and his significance, Nietzsche writes, quote, "Thales saw the unity of the existent, and when he wanted to communicate this idea, he talked of water." End quote. Anaximander, from 610 to 546 BC. Anaximander is also from Miletus. He was a mathematician and an astronomer. According to Diogenes Laertius, quote, "He was the first to draw on a map the outline of land and sea, and he constructed a globe as well." End quote. He is the first among the Pre-Platonics who leaves behind written works. It is said in the descriptions of him that Anaximander carried himself with an overriding sense of grim seriousness in his words and his gestures. His countenance was always dour. He presented himself as though he were the hero within a truly tragic existence. This kind of personality type appears again and again among the Greek philosophers, and it seems that Anaximander is its prototypical exemplar. A tradition holds that Anaximander learned from Thales, but Nietzsche argues that there were no organized institutions of philosophy at that time, and such claims of lineage are probably not true. We can say, however, that Anaximander continued the work of Thales, likely through an oral tradition. He did this by continuing the same line of inquiry as Thales, namely the question, what exists? That is the central question of all the Pre-Platonics, and Anaximander takes further great strides in this direction. Nietzsche says that he moved at a much faster pace than his fellow philosophers. Quote, Thales shows the need of simplifying the empire of plurality and of reducing it to a mere expansion or disguise of the one single existing quality, water. Anaximander goes beyond him." End quote. Perhaps the most famous utterance of Anaximander, containing the central idea of his philosophy, is this, quote, "Whence things originated, thither, according to necessity, they must return and perish, for they must pay penalty and be judged for their injustices according to the order of time." End quote. Anaximander's judgment about reality is based on the observation that becoming and passing away seem to be the only perennial fact that obtains in the case of all individual phenomena. All things are transitory. Thales sees the plurality as transformations and rarefactions of one form of matter, an original unity. But Anaximander asks, why do these transformations occur at all? How can being arise and pass away? It should be noted that in Nietzsche's Pre-Platonic lectures, Thales is not considered a main figure, as he lists him here in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks. Instead, in his lectures, Nietzsche says that Thales is simply a forerunner to Anaximander, who gives the fuller expression of this idea that there is some fundament of reality, some original form of matter, some original form of being. Thales finds this in water, which is a form of matter that has definite qualities. Anaximander still affords a special position to water as the, quote, "semen of the world," end quote, and this is for the reasons that we talked about in the lecture on Thales, and that living things need water to survive. Water inseminates the soil so that plants grow out of it, and so on and so forth. But the further leap which Anaximander takes is to designate the fundamental form of being as something without definite qualities at all. He names it the apeiron, which means the indefinite. It is the origin of all things, which is itself qualityless. Apeiron could be translated many different ways, and we could perhaps elucidate different ways of thinking about it by considering the different ways that the word could be rendered into English. It is unlimited, unconditioned, qualityless, indefinite, undefined. It is that which is prior to all individual definite things, because all that which is defined is delimited. Every thing of which we have experience possesses defining attributes, which designate the thing as individual and differentiate it from everything else. All of these definite, limited, qualified phenomena are also transitory, as mentioned. They are finite, both in their extension as bodies in space, but also in the temporal nature of their existence. And so Anaximander does not suggest another form of matter as the basis of matter, but asks what all of the material things that we encounter have in common. He concludes that they all have limits. His epiphany is that the totality which is prior to them and the cause of them must be some form of being which is unlimited, undefined. Anaximander defines this indefinable thing as such, quote, "the unlimited, embracing and governing all, being immortal and indestructible," end quote. It should be noted that Anaximander doesn't think that all things are contained within the apeiron. And it's not as if the apeiron has a definite quality of being indestructible. It is simply that the defining quality of being destructible does not apply to the apeiron any more than any other quality does. All limited things come from this limitless thing, all mortal things from the immortal, all destructible things from the indestructible, all things with qualities from the qualityless. Anaximander has taken us into true metaphysics for the first time, and he's not satisfied with an appeal to any phenomenon which appears in this world of arising and passing away as an answer to the mystery of existence. Neither the moist nor the hot could be the origin, because the moist and the hot will appear here and then disappear there. Things are moist one minute and then they're dry the next. There's fire and then the fire goes out. these phenomena are subject to change. And so no such transitory phenomenon can be the origin of the all, of existence itself, since all of these limited phenomena are part of that becoming which we're trying to explain. A single part cannot explain the whole. But Anaximander has not explained, up to this point, the reason for arising and passing away. And in the course of attempting to explain it, he introduces moralism into philosophy. This is because we must account for why anything should carve itself off from the indefinite in the first place. Why should anything incarnate as a separate limited being and not remain part of the qualityless origin? Nietzsche writes, quote, "How can anything perish that has a right to exist? Whence that restless becoming and giving birth? Whence that expression of painful distortion on the face of nature? Whence the never-ending dirge in all realms of existence?" End quote. The answer is that all which exists, in fact, has no right to its existence. That, in fact, its very existence is a crime, an injustice. Becoming, this very world of arising and passing away, this world of strife, is a punishment for the injustice of having stolen one's existence from the indefinite. Nietzsche writes, quote, "It may not be very logical. It is, however, at any rate very human, and moreover quite in harmony with the philosophical leaping described above. Now with Anaximander to consider all becoming as a punishable emancipation from eternal being, as a wrong that is to be atoned for by destruction. Everything that has once come into existence also perishes, whether we think of human life, or of water, or of heat and cold. Everywhere where definite qualities are to be noticed, we are allowed to prophesy the extinction of these qualities, according to the all-embracing proof of experience. Thus, a being that possesses definite qualities and consists of them can never be the origin and principle of things. The veritable ens, the existent, Anaximander concluded, cannot possess any definite qualities. Otherwise, like all other things, it would necessarily have originated and perished. In order that becoming may not cease, the primordial being must be indefinite. The immortality and eternity of the primordial being lies not in an indefiniteness and inexhaustibility, as usually the expounders of Anaximander presuppose, but in this, that it lacks the definite qualities which lead to destruction, for which reason it also bears its name, the indefinite. The thus labeled primordial being is superior to all becoming, and for this very reason, it guarantees the eternity and unimpeded course of becoming. This last unity in that indefinite, the mother womb of all things, can, it is true, be designated only negatively by man, as something to which no predicate out of the existing world of becoming can be allotted, and might be considered a peer to the Kantian thing in itself. End quote. So, Anaximander's main idea is compared here to Kant by Nietzsche, insofar as the apeiron is exactly as unknowable, as indescribable as Kant's thing in itself, the noumenon. Anaximander has also been compared to Schopenhauer, who took Kant's distinction between thing in itself and appearance very seriously, and also philosophized with a sort of grim judgment upon existence. In fact, Schopenhauer comes to many of the same moral conclusions as Anaximander, that the source of all suffering is existence itself, and the negation of one's existence is thus the relief of suffering. For Anaximander, to be absorbed again into the indefinite is the recompense for having transgressed and the rectifying of the injustice against being. Nietzsche describes Anaximander's significance as consisting precisely in this moral narrative about the nature of being. The strife that we experience within becoming, the suffering and conflict and death and loss and tragedy of existence, is because of the crime that we committed against being, which ought to have remained in its natural state, quote-unquote, as unmoving, unchanging, immortal, undefined, qualityless. In other words, dead, non-existent, really, at least beyond any human conception of existence. Life is strife, and this is a consequence of life being stolen from non-life, unlife, that which does not possess the quality or definite aspect of being alive, from the totally undefined, unlimited origin. And so there's a kind of fault to existence itself, or a kind of guilt to existence. Becoming and its suffering is evidence of that guilt, and the persevering, unmoving, immortal nature of the aperon is evidence of its true being. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Out of this world of injustice, of audacious apostasy from the primordial unity of things, Anaximander flees into a metaphysical castle, leaning out of which he turns his gaze far and wide, in order at last, after a pensive silence, to address to all beings this question: What is your existence worth? And if it is worth nothing, why are you there? By your guilt I observe, you sojourn in this world. You will have to expiate it by death. Look how your earth fades. The seas decrease and dry up. The marine shell on the mountain shows you how much already they have dried up. Fire destroys your world even now. Finally, it will end in smoke and ashes. But again and again, such a world of transitoriness will ever build itself up. Who shall redeem you from the curse of becoming?" End quote. Anaximander, therefore, elaborates on the work of Thales in one sense. He brings into focus the full complexity of the question, what exists, by inquiring after the reason for arising and passing away. In another sense, however, his central idea is entirely different from that of Thales, because there is nothing moralistic in Thales. Anaximander creates the moral interpretation of existence. Arising and passing away is explained through that principle of guilt and the recompense for that guilt. And yet Nietzsche describes a darkness following over the world of Greek philosophy as a result of this pessimistic worldview created by Anaximander. It is the darkness of ignorance falling over the Greek mind, which has further been darkened by Anaximander's dismal view of life as something faulty. For the mind still wonders, quote, "Yet why has not everything that has become perished long ago, since indeed quite an eternity of time has already gone by? Whence the ceaseless current of the river of becoming?" End quote. This question, inquiring after the apparent meaninglessness of existence and yet its eternal continuation, is a terrible one. It brings us almost fully into that pessimistic Schopenhauerian perspective. And yet that world is also rendered inexplicable. Why becoming, if the origin is unchanging being? For all the great leaps of Anaximander, this matter remains obscure from the Anaximandrian perspective. It is at this point that another such single-minded sage comes to the forefront. Heraclitus, circa 500 BC. Heraclitus was from Ephesus on the Anatolian Peninsula in modern-day Turkey. He was one of its leading citizens, but perhaps one of the most significant things that we know about the life of Heraclitus is that he voluntarily retired from public life and renounced Ephesus. As for why this happened, it is at least superficially a political dispute, but in truth Heraclitus had a more profound and damning critique of the Ephesians as people. Because of the location of their city-state, the Ephesians had to cautiously manage their relationship to the Persians. Nietzsche tells us that while he was in public life, Heraclitus was, quote, "a merciless opponent of democratic parties," end quote. Among the Democrats in Ephesus, there were radical elements who wished to pursue a more aggressive posture to antagonize the Persians. Nietzsche writes, and this isn't in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, but he includes this detail in his Pre-Platonic lecture notes, quote, "Heraclitus, like his friend Hermodorus, had probably counseled against reckless measures against the Persians, and both were decried as friends of the Persians, until Hermodorus was ostracized. Heraclitus left the city voluntarily, giving up his archonship. He subsequently resided in seclusion at the Temple of Artemis." End quote. Heraclitus lived, if not in total solitude, apart from the rest of society. He could sometimes be found playing knucklebones with the children. In one famous anecdote, some of the other leading Ephesians came to see him at the temple. As they gathered around him and stared in disbelief, he said, quote, "Why, you rascals, are you astonished? Is it not better to do this than to take part in your civic life?" End quote. Another detail that Nietzsche gets from Diogenes Laertius is something that Heraclitus said of his banishment. Quote, "The Ephesians would do well to end their lives, every grown man of them, and leave the city to beardless boys. For that they have driven out Hermodorus, the worthiest man among them, saying, We will have none who is worthiest among us, or if there be any such, let him go elsewhere and consort with others." End quote. This is the result of the Greek practice of ostracism, in which every year the polis would vote on some individual to banish. Nietzsche suggests in the essay Homer's Contest that they did this not out of fear of tyrants or out of spite, because even though such things certainly happened in the long history of the practice, this was not the original purpose or motivation behind ostracism. The point was to continue the agon, the social competition. If there was ever any individual that was too outstanding, that completely dominated in some way, a rhapsode so good that none of the other rhapsodes could even hold a candle to their performances, for example, the competition then for who would be the best rhapsode would stall out. So it's best to banish that person in order to continue the social contest. The result of this, however, is that over time the most ambitious, most accomplished people found themselves banished. Heraclitus sees the folly in this. He eventually sees the folly in the entirety of public life and the power games of politics. He perceives that those who are the best in any society will find themselves expelled or else hammered down by the swarm of mediocre people. This assessment of the way that the collective acts is influential on Nietzsche's thought. Heraclitus is so disgusted with this state of affairs that the opinion that would rise to ascendance over the minds of the majority would be that the polis ought to be more aggressive and reckless in their foreign policy, and that this opinion not only just wins out, but that they would then banish the rational, cool-headed people. Heraclitus is so repulsed by this that he simply banishes himself. This backstory is essential for understanding Heraclitus and his whole character, which fascinated Nietzsche almost as much as the Heraclitean philosophy. Heraclitus is regal and self-assured to the maximum degree. We might call it arrogance. He is solitary because in all other men he sees only childishness and error. Only within himself does he find the truth, and he speaks directly from his own intuitive certainty. He does not feel a dialectical responsibility to justify his philosophy to the many by means of logical persuasion. And he does not approach philosophy, as Thales or Anaximander did, as a scientific thinker. This is the power of Heraclitus's archetype, and his thought is directly tied to his being this unique type of person, standing aside from any sort of discipline or lineage of thinkers. Nietzsche writes in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, section 8, quote, "Heraclitus was proud, and if it comes to pride with a philosopher, then it is a great pride. His work never refers him to a public, the applause of the masses, and the hailing chorus of contemporaries. To wander lonely along his path belongs to the nature of the philosopher. His talents are the rarest, in a certain sense the most unnatural, and at the same time exclusive and hostile even toward kindred talents. The wall of his self-sufficiency must be of diamond, if it is not to be demolished and broken, for everything is in motion against him. His journey to immortality is more cumbersome and impeded than any other, and yet nobody can believe more firmly than the philosopher that he will attain the goal by that journey, because he does not know where he is to stand if not on the widely spread wings of all time. For the disregard of everything present and momentary lies in the essence of the great philosophic nature. He has truth. The wheel of time may roll whither it pleases, never can it escape from truth. It is important to hear that such men have lived." Such men live in their own solar system. One has to look for them there. Of that feeling of solitude which permeated the Ephesian recluse of the Artemis temple, one can only divine something when growing benumbed in the wildest mountain desert. No paramount feeling of compassionate agitation, no desire to help, heal, and save emanates from him. He is a star without an atmosphere. His eye, directed blazingly inwards, looks outward for appearance's sake only, extinct and icy. All around him, immediately upon the citadel of his pride, beat the waves of folly and perversity. With loathing, he turns away from them. But men with a feeling heart would also shun such a Gorgon monster as cast out of brass. Within an out-of-the-way sanctuary among the statues of gods, by the side of cold, composedly sublime architecture, such a being may appear more comprehensible. As a man among men, Heraclitus was incredible, and though he was seen paying attention to the play of noisy children, even then he was reflecting upon what man never thought of on such an occasion: the play of the great world-child Zeus. He had no need of men, not even for his discernments. He was not interested in all that which one might perhaps ascertain from them, and in what other sages before him had been endeavoring to ascertain. He spoke with disdain of such questioning, collecting, in short, historic men. "I sought and investigated myself," he said, with a word by which one designates the investigation of an oracle, as if he and no one else were the true fulfiller and achiever of the Delphic precept, "Know thyself." End quote. That is a beautiful section of Nietzschean prose, and I think it's a confession from Nietzsche of just how thoroughly he was indebted to this man. This is where Nietzsche found the highest archetype of the philosopher from his perspective. Out of all of these figures, Heraclitus is the archetype with whom Nietzsche identifies, the solitary thinker who seeks and investigates himself, who understands their own reason to be the final and ultimate authority. Perhaps with Heraclitus this is taken to an extreme that may be imprudent. You end up setting yourself at odds with everyone in society around you. You see no relevant wisdom in those around you whatsoever. This could be seen as one of the benefits of these single-minded sages. In being sculpted out of a single stone, they each become a sort of maximum, a limit case for a certain type of thought. In Heraclitus, we find something admirable, something desirable to emulate, and that he creates that diamond wall of self-sufficiency. Remember that great task of Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example, self-reliance. Heraclitus exhibits that same virtue. And for those of us who feel as though we are inhabiting a world ruled by childishness and folly, that sense of relying on one's self and trusting in one's own wisdom and one's own intuition as the final authority, that can be immensely valuable. Even though, admittedly, it is a dangerous path. It leaves you open to falling into error yourself, in which there will not be a corrective from the external world. Trust in yourself is both a wonderful thing and a dangerous thing. Now that we have established who Heraclitus is, we might return to the lingering question in the wake of Anaximander's philosophical project, and that is, why is there becoming instead of being? If becoming is a kind of punishment for stealing our existence from the indefinite, an injustice which will be settled by reabsorption into the infinite, why hasn't everything been reabsorbed? Why hasn't becoming long since come to an end? Why this endless river of becoming? Nietzsche explains how Heraclitus addresses this. Quote, "Heraclitus denied the duality of two quite diverse worlds." End quote. These two diverse worlds to which Nietzsche refers are being and becoming, or we might say the Kantian distinction of noumenon and phenomena, thing in itself and appearance, or to use Anaximandrian language, the world of the indefinite and the world of definite things. Nietzsche continues in the passage, quote, "He no longer distinguished a physical world from a metaphysical, a realm of definite qualities from a realm of indefinable indefiniteness. Now, after this first step, he could neither be kept back any longer from a still greater audacity of denying. he denied being altogether. For this one world which was left to him, shielded all round by eternal unwritten laws, flowing up and down in the brazen beat of rhythm, shows nowhere persistence, indestructibility, a bulwark in the stream. Louder than Anaximander, Heraclitus exclaimed, "I see nothing but becoming. Be not deceived. It is the fault of your limited outlook, and not the fault of the essence of things, if you believe that you see firm land anywhere in the ocean of becoming and passing. You need names for things, just as if they had a rigid permanence, but the very river in which you bathe a second time is no longer the same one which you entered before." End quote. That last sentence, of course, refers to one of the most famous of Heraclitus's aphorisms: "One does not step into the same river twice," suggesting something very profound. The river is not something that possesses being. The whole thought model of being would suggest that there is a sort of essence to the river, a river in itself, which exists independently of the phenomenal experience of the river, and in spite of whatever changes, momentary changes or transitoriness may exist in the expression or the phenomenal existence of the river, there's a sort of quote-unquote real thing there. There's some sort of river that actually exists, which is a definable thing with boundaries and limits that we can sort of grab onto with our perception and with our language. That there is a identity to the river. The trouble with positing such an essential identity to the river is the very fact that the river flows, it moves. The water that makes up the river is never the same from moment to moment. If it were the same water every moment, then it wouldn't be flowing, meaning it would not be a river. You can't ever break down the river into constituent parts and determine where the river starts and ends. Rivers shift and move over the course of centuries, decades even. Even though we think of the river as a thing, the river is simply the result of, for example, snowmelt from the mountains flowing downhill. The river is a happening rather than a thing. It's an event or a process rather than an essence. This is the sense in which Heraclitus rejects all being. He sees only becoming, only events, not things. These phenomena that arise and pass away have no underlying essence or identity to anchor them. So the reason why this river of becoming continues is because existence is not an injustice that must be rectified. There is no being, no limitless aberon from which our existence was stolen. Our particular existence, our phenomenal existence, is in fact not even a reality that we can point to. It's just an event or a process. It's not as if we're a thing that carved itself off from being. The notion of the aperon, the indefinite, the qualityless, indestructible being is nothing more than a fiction, an error created by men of little discernment. There's no end to becoming because there's no beginning to becoming. The river of existence simply flows on endlessly. Accordingly, Heraclitus likens existence to fire. In a sense, perhaps more profound than Thales' assertion that all matter is a transformation of water. We might think of fire as something more akin to energy in our modern lexicon, and perhaps fire was the only example that Heraclitus had at hand to describe energy. There's some of that artfulness here, some of that poetry that constitutes the leap of the pre-Platonic philosopher. Fire comes into being and then disappears from being. While the wood or the fuel that one uses for fire clearly still exists, it transforms into something else, it becomes ashes, for example, the actual flame seems to just appear and then disappear, to be there one moment and then gone the next. It's a real-life demonstration of a rising and passing away, of coming into being and then blinking out of being. Meanwhile, fire also dances around. It seems to flow, to leap, to swell, to dissolve. It's a bit unpredictable. It can be both destructive and creative, useful and catastrophic. It has all these elements that make it ideal as the allegory for what Heraclitus thinks the world is, which he puts forth famously in Fragment 30. Quote, "This universe, which is the same for all, has not been made by any god or man, but it has always been, is, and will be an ever-living fire, kindling itself by regular measures and going out by regular measures." End quote. So, this world of transitory existence has always been, is, and will be, which means transitory existence is eternal. That which is indestructible is the world, this totality of becoming itself, we might say. This existence that's defined by arising and passing away. It's not that there is something in itself which is eternal. What we ascribe that eternal status to in Heraclitean philosophy is becoming itself, which means change itself. If the question from the beginning has been what is, and we have proceeded by asking about the fundamental nature of matter, then about the origin of the different forms of matter, Heraclitus's answer is that what is this changeable existence. The answer is not found in some truth which is quote-unquote behind the world. Thales argued that out of the one came the many, out of one substance comes many different forms of existence. Heraclitus argues, quote, "The one is the many," end quote. The identity of becoming, the essence or self-existence of becoming, is the fact that becoming is multiple. Change, movement, these concepts suggest or demand multiplicity. You could never have movement in an existence that consisted of a purely static, unchangeable being. And since Heraclitus denies this sort of being, the only suggestion of such an identity to all things is that they are governed by what Heraclitus calls logos, a law or reason, which we might consider something akin to what we would call the laws of nature. That if anything enduring exists, that law is what exists, and the character of that law is change. What is enduring is change. This Heraclitean view produces a very different conception of justice in relation to life and existence than the view of Anaximander. Anaximander says that it is on account of injustice that our lives consist of strife. And the Heraclitean view, quote, "Strife is justice," end quote. There is nothing inherently terrible about strife that makes it self-evidently a punishment against living things. In fact, since this living phenomenal existence is the very fabric of being, since becoming is being, that means that strife is part of the nature of that being, part of the logos that governs it. This is how Heraclitus arrives at the harsh notion that, quote, "War is the father of all," end quote, because there is no higher authority or transcendental form of being which governs the phenomenal world. Rather, that the world is governed by laws which are internal to it, not imposed from above. Heraclitus sees that conflict is the natural pattern that apprehends in the world. The world is a play of forces, sometimes a dance, sometimes a battle. There's a creative aspect to this play, there's a destructive aspect to it, but it is play, something innocent, something which is not condemned by the strife that takes place within it. The metaphor that he uses is that of children playing. Fragment 52, quote, "Time is a child playing draughts. The kingly power is a child's," end quote. The spirit of the world is like the boy god Aeon, god of the zodiac, who plays innocently. This is not a theodicy. It's not a justification of the evil in the world, as we might say Anaximander engaged in. Rather, it's the refusal to justify the world at all. It's all just a game. Whatever pleasure or pain, sorrow or joy existed within the roil of that ever-living fire, it was not created to fulfill a somber morality tale. It simply happened. If we were to say that there is a divinity moving the world, we would say that this divinity did it all for fun, and that's that. Nietzsche writes in section 7, quote, "Heraclitus is not compelled to prove, as Leibniz was, that this world was even the best of all. It was sufficient for him that the world is the beautiful, innocent play of the Aeon. Man, on the whole, is to him even an irrational being, with which the fact that in all his essence the law of all-ruling reason is fulfilled does not clash. He does not occupy a specially favored position in nature, whose highest phenomenon is not simple-minded man, but fire, for instance, as stars. Insofar as man has through necessity received a share of fire, he is a little more rational. As far as he consists of earth and water, it stands badly within his reason. He is not compelled to take cognizance of the Logos simply because he is a human being. Why is there water? Why earth? This, to Heraclitus, is a much more serious problem than to ask why men are so stupid and bad. In the highest and the most perverted men, the same inherent lawfulness and justice manifest themselves. If, however, one would ask Heraclitus the question, why is fire not always fire? Why is it now water, now earth? Then he would only just answer, it is a game. Don't take it too seriously, and still less morally. Heraclitus describes only the existing world and has the same contemplative pleasure in it which the artist experiences when looking at his growing work. Only those who have cause to be disconcerted with his natural history of man find him gloomy, melancholy, tearful, somber, atrabilious, pessimistic, and altogether hateful. He, however, would take these discontented people, together with their antipathies and sympathies, their hatred and their love, as negligible, and perhaps answer them with some such comment as, quote, dogs bark at anything they do not know, or, quote, to the ass, chaff is preferable to gold, end quote. Those last two remarks that Nietzsche cites are among Heraclitus's most quotable aphorisms, and they indicate that from a given perspective, a phenomena could be experienced differently than it might be from the perspective of another type of being. A dog barks at anyone they don't know, meaning if a person walks into a room, even if the dog can't see the person, the dog can smell them, right? The dog will react differently depending on whether they smell a familiar person or a total stranger. Or the donkey prefers straw to gold. Presumably, human beings would prefer gold to straw because we use gold in our economic system. Gold can buy you quite a bit of straw as well as other things that you might want. But there's no inherent value to gold that makes it better than straw. Its value is given to it by human beings. It has no value at all to the donkey, who would prefer the straw that it can actually eat. This is, in roughly 500 BC, a perspectivist approach to philosophy. Heraclitus is saying, you invest phenomena with the values that they have. Things have the sense and value that they have based on who and what you are, not based on some quality inherent to the object. The object is not valuable in and of itself. Gold is not valuable in and of itself. If a dog barks at one person and not another, it's not because the first person was bad and the second person was good. It just means the dog knows one person and he doesn't know the other person. He has an association with one but not the other. This may seem like a minor or even an obvious point, but this is the real consequence of denying being. There are no inherent qualities to things, only what we give them. This even applies to the way we sense the thing and experience it, because sensation itself occurs at the intersection of the object with our sense organs. It depends on our sense organs such that we're able to represent the object to ourselves. These insights would be profoundly important to countless philosophers of the continental tradition and afterwards, from Hegel to Nietzsche to Deleuze to Heidegger. All in all, Heraclitus leaves us with a world which is the game of Aeon or Zeus, however we want to name the supreme deity. It's a perspective on life which makes primary the embodied living world. Of all the Pre-Platonics, Nietzsche seems to see the greatest enduring value in Heraclitus. Nietzsche writes, quote, the world needs truth eternally. Therefore she needs also Heraclitus eternally, although he has no need of her. What does his fame matter to him? Fame with mortals ever flowing on, as he exclaims scornfully. His fame is of concern to man, not to himself. The immortality of mankind needs him, not he the immortality of the man Heraclitus. That which he beheld, the doctrine of the law and the becoming, and of the play in the necessity, must henceforth be beheld eternally. He has raised the curtain of this greatest stage play. End quote. Of course, the philosophical dialogue of the Pre-Platonics is far from over. Having seemingly eliminated static being from the discourse with his philosophy of becoming, Heraclitus was destined to remain an obscure figure. It is simply not the kind of assertion that the ordinary people with their lack of discernment will be able to believe in. And meanwhile, another philosopher, with whom he was a contemporary, a man from Elea, began an entire school in which being would return with a vengeance. This figure, Parmenides, takes the inverse stance of Heraclitus and denies becoming. The Eleatic school of Parmenides is the topic that will begin our next episode. Parmenides' conception of being will be profoundly influential on Plato and countless others to come. He is the next significant voice in this narrative. I hope you'll join me then for the continuation of philosophy and the tragic age of the Greeks in our examination of Parmenides, Anaxagoras, Empedocles, and Democritus. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Signing off. Thus far, we've considered the first cosmologists of what Nietzsche called Pre-Platonic philosophy. These figures consist, in the main, of Thales, Anaximander, and Heraclitus, and they all concern themselves with the question, what exists? What is the explanation for material existence? And they attempt to answer this question quite remarkably without recourse to mythological explanations. They do not produce cosmogonies, but cosmologies, attempts at representing the origins of matter and of living things, but without using magic or the will of a personified deity as the prime mover. Thales says that all being derives from water. All elements or individual things are transformations of water. Anaximander says that the original source of being cannot be something particular like water, which exists within that totality of being. In fact, it cannot be something that has any qualities at all, since all transitory, limited things are defined by qualities. Anaximander suggested something indefinite, something qualityless and prior to all the things that exist in their particularity, in this existence that is characterized by limitations and causes. Furthermore, he argued that the strife within existence is evidence that existence itself was at fault in some way, that individual things steal their existence from the indefinite, and this injustice is rectified when they eventually pass away and return to the indefinite. But a question is left in the wake of the notion of Anaximander, namely, why does becoming continue? Why do things continue to arise and pass away? Why hasn't all becoming been reabsorbed into the indefinite? Heraclitus arrives at this point in the dialogue. He rejects being entirely. He rejects the distinction between being and becoming. He suggests that all that exists is this arising and passing away. There is not some qualityless, indestructible state of being from which becoming quote-unquote emerges. Rather, the cosmos never began at all, and it will never end. Existence is governed by an eternal law of change, the logos, and to the extent that there is a nature or a character to existence, it is this very law. Existence for Heraclitus is innocent, and the strife which takes place within this world is therefore also innocent. It is not evidence of a fault to Heraclitus, it is simply the nature of existence, which quite blindly and innocently comes into conflicts. Life is a play of forces, an ever-living fire. Strife is justice. But a question remains still, even after Heraclitus. He hasn't put to bed every metaphysical problem simply by rejecting this idea of static being. Perhaps the best way to put this question to ourselves is to consider something that I didn't really mention when we were talking about Heraclitus, but is an important element of Heraclitus's philosophy in light of the response to it. When we say that, quote-unquote, the world is eternal, to Heraclitus, we necessarily mean existence itself. But in Heraclitean philosophy, just as individual things are born, grow, flourish, and then grow old and die, Heraclitus believes that whole worlds are born, flourish, grow old, and die. In much the same way as the Hindus believe that over long kalpas, an entire cosmos comes into being and eventually is destroyed, well, then another cosmos arises in its place. Heraclitus thinks that this world will eventually be reclaimed by the ever-living fire, like all things are, but in the wake of this destruction, there's always a new world. The ever-living fire always returns in some new form. We cannot even say that the ever-living fire exists from the individual forms that it takes. The difference between Heraclitus and Anaximander is that Heraclitus doesn't think that reality returns to a sort of default state of the indefinite. Rather, it truly goes out of existence, like a flame that is snuffed out. Flame is used as an example by Heraclitus because of the very fact that it comes into being and passes away. It truly seems to vanish, leaving nothing behind. Notice what we have to take on, then, if we are to agree with Heraclitus on every last point. Unfortunately, we find ourselves at odds with modern science, for one, because Heraclitus would deny the conservation of matter and energy. He would say, no, things really do get destroyed, and then new things are born. Sure, we can say that it's all the same ever-living fire, but things really are snuffed out of existence, and then new things are kindled anew. The real consequence of believing in arising and passing away is that it commits us to a metaphysical view that things go from non-existence to existence, and from existence to non-existence. The cyclical destruction of worlds is arising and passing away, but on the cosmic scale. This problem would be central for Parmenides. He is a contemporary of Heraclitus, and he takes exactly the opposite stance toward being. In so doing, he founds the Eleatic school of philosophy. Parmenides, circa 485 BC. Parmenides was from Elea, which was part of Magna Graecia, the Greek colonies in Italy. The school of philosophy known as the Eleatics takes its name from this city. For our purposes, Parmenides will serve as the sole representative of this school of thought. What we know of his philosophy comes to us from a very long poem entitled On Nature, written in hexameter. Originally, it ran to 800 lines, but now only around 150 lines of it remain. It's what we call Parmenides' fragments. Parmenides seems to have met Xenophanes, a rhetorician and poet whom Nietzsche thinks made a profound impact on Parmenides. And Parmenides would then go on to teach Zeno, the philosopher who is famous for giving us Zeno's paradox. As far as the character of Parmenides, it's said that he attempted to emulate the solemn and dignified bearing of religious figures, people such as the cult leader Pythagoras. While we can say that every such Pre-Platonic concerned him with the question, what is? The most compelling thing about Parmenides is that he proceeds by asking the same question from the opposite direction. What isn't? He inquires about non-being. He attempts to figure out just what we're talking about when we refer to non-being. Non-being becomes a bit of a mystery to Parmenides. And yet we might note, non-being is key to the entire explanation of arising and passing away. It's therefore key to the entire Heraclitean understanding of becoming, in which things truly begin to exist and then cease to exist. That is becoming in a nutshell, and that is the strife, the change that Anaximander sees as evidence of life's faultiness. For Heraclitus, the strife is innocent, like the play of a child. For Anaximander, it's guilty. But in both cases, it is presumed that this arising and passing away really happens. Parmenides takes issue with just that notion. However, Parmenides, like many other philosophers, is a man with two eras to his thought. People speak of Wittgenstein I and Wittgenstein II, for example, the early and later Wittgenstein. Well, there's also a Parmenides I and Parmenides II. Both Parmenideses address themselves to this problem of non-being, but they handle it in two very different ways. And Nietzsche goes so far as to say that the difference between early Parmenides and later Parmenides is a sort of dividing line in Pre-Platonic philosophy. Parmenides himself contains the end of one era and the beginning of another. Quote, Parmenides once had, probably in his later years, a moment of the very purest abstraction, undimmed by any reality, perfectly lifeless. This moment, un-Greek, like no other in the 2 centuries of the tragic age, the product of which is the doctrine of being, became a boundary stone for his whole life, which divided it into two periods. At the same time, however, the same moment divides the pre-Socratic thinking into two halves, of which the first might be called the Anaximandrian, the second the Parmenidean. The first period in Parmenides' own philosophizing bears still the signature of Anaximander. This period produced a detailed philosophic physical system as answer to Anaximander's questions. When later that icy abstraction horror caught him, and the simplest proposition treating of being and not being was advanced by him, then among the many older doctrines thrown by him upon the scrap heap was also his own system." End quote. So the early work of Parmenides is an answer to Anaximander. It's his Anaximandrian period, as Nietzsche calls it. His second period is what Parmenides is primarily known for. This is usually what people are referring to when they talk about the philosophy of Parmenides, and it's characterized by his pure theory of being. To see how he gets to this theory of pure being, it is worth examining his Anaximandrian period first. Anaximander causes a problem by posing us with dual and diverse worlds. There is the apparent world of becoming, and then the indefinite from which becoming snatches its existence. Heraclitus had resolved this division between appearance and reality, and his solution is to assert the reality of becoming and reject being. Parmenides approaches this from yet another perspective. His Anaximandrian period is characterized by a non-dualist project to establish becoming as something active and existent, which means to establish arising and passing away as something wholly active and existent. But this attempt of Parmenides results somewhat humorously in a proposed division of every phenomena into the category of either positive, existent, or negative, non-existent. A dualistic categorization scheme, we might say, in order to resolve dualism. The reasoning for why early Parmenides creates this set of categories is quite simple. If becoming is the primary reality, and this consists of arising and passing away, then that means that both coming into being and going out of being are real things, quote unquote. Non-being is therefore a real thing. And this is to say that certain phenomena that we experience are actually non-being or non-phenomena. We might say we're just experiencing the effect of non-existence. Certain phenomena are actually just passing away as it manifests itself within the becoming. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Parmenides compared the qualities one with another and believed that they were not all of the same kind, but ought to be classified under two headings. If, for example, he compared bright and dark, then the second quality was obviously only the negation of the first, and thus he distinguished positive and negative qualities, seriously endeavoring to rediscover and register that fundamental antithesis in the whole realm of nature. Before his gaze, our empiric world divided itself into two separate spheres, into that of the positive qualities with a bright, fiery, warm, light, rare, active masculine character, and into that of the negative qualities. The latter express really only the lack, the absence of the others, the positive ones. He therefore described the sphere in which the positive qualities are absent as dark, earthy, cold, heavy, dense, and altogether as of a feminine passive character. Instead of the expressions positive and negative, he used the standing term existent and non-existent, and had arrived with this at the proposition that, in contradiction to Anaximander, this world contains something existent and of course something non-existent. One is not to seek that existent outside the world and as it were above our horizon, but before us and everywhere, in every becoming, something existent and active is contained." End quote. So that is Nietzsche's summary of Parmenides 1, and if you're familiar at all with the yin-yang idea or philosophy central to Chinese thought, you'll notice that Parmenides comes to many of the same categorizations, and he even associates the positive, the existent, with the active and masculine. This also includes the bright, the fiery, the warm, whereas the negative is feminine, dark, earthy, damp. These associations are all perfectly in line with yin and yang of Chinese philosophy. But the philosophy of Parmenides, too, is the philosophy for which he is so well known, as we've said. And the impetus for this shift in his thought seems to come almost as a divine revelation for Parmenides. He is struck with a profound idea, and his whole categorization schema for determining which phenomena are positive and which are negative, all of that is at this point smashed into dust. The revelation occurs when Parmenides poses a simple question. What is non-being? I'm going to read here from section 10 of Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks in an abridged form. Quote, "There was a day upon which an odd idea suddenly occurred to Parmenides, an idea which seemed to take all value away from his former combinations, so that he felt inclined to throw them aside, like a money bag with old worn-out coins. On that day, he examined his two cooperating antitheses, the existent and the non-existent, the positive and the negative qualities, of which desire and hatred constitute the world and the becoming. He was suddenly caught up, mistrusting, by the idea of negative quality, of the non-existent. For can something which does not exist be a quality? Or to put the question in a broader sense, can anything indeed which does not exist, exist? The only form of knowledge in which we at once put unconditional trust, and the disapproval of which amounts to madness, is the tautology A equals A. But this very tautological knowledge called inexorably to him. What does not exist, exists not. What is. Suddenly, he feels upon his life the load of an enormous logical sin. For had he not always, without hesitation, assumed that there were existing negative qualities, in short, a non-existent, that therefore, to express it by a formula, A equals not A, which indeed could only be advanced by the most out-and-out perversity of thinking. It is true, as he recollected, the whole great mass of men judge with the same perversity. He himself has only participated in the general crime against logic. But the same moment which charges him with this crime surrounds him with the light of the glory of an invention. He has found, apart from all human illusion, a principle, the key to the world secret. He now descends into the abyss of things, guided by the firm and fearful hand of the tautological truth as to being." End quote. It's worth noting several things about this single powerful thought of Parmenides, that the non-existent doesn't exist, and only what is exists. For one, even though I described it as akin to the religious experience, like the other Pre-Platonics, Parmenides snatches this revelation from the ether with purely the faculty of his own reasoning. It's a kind of iron logical commandment that Parmenides perceives. And Nietzsche says that this grasping of this abstract truth is a wondrous abstraction, but simultaneously it is a descent into the abyss. And Nietzsche describes Parmenides numerous times as spider-like, weaving a web with his logic. And unlike the fire and water that we find in the spirit of the earlier cosmologists, people like Heraclitus and Thales, these thinkers who entangled themselves with the movement and the material of the phenomenal world, Nietzsche says that the feeling one gets from the philosophy of Parmenides is that it is frozen. Nietzsche says that he, quote, dives into the cold bath of his icy abstractions, end quote. If non-being doesn't exist, then change and transformation do not exist either, which means they must be illusions. Motion, a great metaphysical riddle, therefore doesn't exist either, because this presupposes that bodies could move through negative space, that there could be pockets of non-being within which beings could move. But such pockets of non-being can't possibly exist. Furthermore, time is also such an illusion. This would also preclude the existence of motion. The reason why time is an illusion is because what is what is now, not what was or what will be. Those are just other ways of describing something that does not exist. Nietzsche describes Eleatic thought as a view of being bound in logical chains. The result of their ideas is that the world is rendered static, innate, and dead. The Parmenidean view of reality ultimately is that it is an unmoving, eternal, spherical form. That is what Parmenides says the world is. A definite, existent thing, which always is and does not change. It does not exist within time. Our perceptions of motion and change are nothing more than the delusions of the people who trust in their senses. Parmenides says, quote, "Do not follow the dim-sighted eyes, nor the resounding ear, nor the tongue, but examine only by the power of thought." End quote. Nietzsche says that the power of Parmenides' will for certainty is something admirable, but that ultimately the Eleatic philosophy is a false path. Parmenides ceases to be a natural philosopher at all, and on this point, Nietzsche agrees with the likes of Aristotle. The interest in the natural world ceases with Parmenides. The direction of thought turns entirely to the abstract laws which we impose on reality, due to what Nietzsche would later write is a grammatical faith. In Parmenides, we can see a figure who had a profound influence on Plato in this respect. The philosopher is he who does not trust the senses, and the fact that any man who trusts his senses comes to a number of what we call common sense conclusions about reality is not an argument in favor of those common sense conclusions. The great many are deluded. Wisdom is the purview of a select few. That much is obvious to the likes of Parmenides. And thus, by rejecting the senses and seeking certainty in abstract thought, Parmenides provides yet another piece of the Platonic philosophy that will later come into being. That being said, Nietzsche thinks that the later Parmenides offers us a philosophy, quote, void of content, end quote. It is clear where Nietzsche stands, given what he would write in Twilight of Idols. He sides eternally with Heraclitus, who rejected being and upheld only becoming, and so he rejects Parmenides, who denied becoming and upheld only being. Nietzsche rejects this because becoming is the given reality. This is what is given to us by our experience of the world. While Nietzsche certainly might have been sympathetic to arguments that we should not simply go along with the common sense wisdom, he believes that this journey into the world of abstractions is a sort of prefiguration of the ascetic's otherworldly attitude. A pure theory of being inevitably becomes a type of philosophy that Nietzsche would call bloodless. He says that Parmenides doesn't even hint at the kind of Buddhistic salvation from becoming that one might find in Schopenhauer or in his pre-Platonic precursor, Anaximander. There is none of the Indian breeze that Nietzsche detects in the work of Anaximander. He says that Parmenidean thought is, quote, the very absence of fragrance, color, soul, form, the total lack of blood, religiosity, and ethical warmth, the abstract schematic, in a Greek, end quote. In his own way, however, Parmenides' way of inquiring after the nature of reality for all its problems opens the way for the next class of thinkers among the Pre-Platonics. Nietzsche explains this in his Pre-Platonic lectures, quote, through him specifically, the problem of becoming came into philosophy, not through the Eleatics. That they deny it is the shortest way out, yet the least illuminating. With this ceases all observation of nature, all desire to learn from things. Then the fundamental failure remains, that the apparatus of the senses is inexplicable. It moves itself. It is in plurality. If it itself is a delusion, how can it be the final cause of a second delusion? The senses deceive, but what if the senses did not exist? How could they deceive? So plurality and motion of the senses certainly exist, and so everything else may be moved and manifold. End quote. Anaxagoras, 500 BC to 428 BC. Anaxagoras of Clazomenae is the first of the movement known as the pluralists. Anaxagoras is the prototypical example of the natural philosopher who challenged the religious dogmatists. His influence on Socrates was profound in this way. Anaxagoras was from Persia, but was forced to flee to Athens. Persia was a country ruled by sun worshippers who would not have accepted the Anaxagorean theory that the sun was a burning ball of metal. Anaxagoras lived in Athens for many years after this, and considered himself an Athenian, but eventually came into conflict with the religious dogmatists there too. He fled Athens a few years before his death. When someone remarked that it was a shame for him to die in exile, Anaxagoras said, quote, "The descent to Hades is much the same from whatever place we start." End quote. Anaxagoras was influential in both the example of his life and his character on two of the most important Hellenic Greeks, Socrates, as we've mentioned, and Pericles. Socrates was influenced by his willingness to challenge the religious dogma of the Athenians in the name of truth, but Nietzsche argues that the greatest Anaxagorean of all was Pericles. What Pericles learned from Anaxagoras was, above all, his demeanor, the way that Anaxagoras presented himself, the way that Anaxagoras walked and moved and spoke, his gestures and his bearing. This is what Pericles learned. Anaxagoras was known to never smile, to speak and comport himself with a sort of awe-inspiring dignity. Pericles was the Athenian general who led his people through the Spartan siege of the city of Athens during the Peloponnesian War, and he's best known for his funeral oration. In this speech, he stirred the spirit of the Athenians to fight on, imploring his countrymen to remember that Athens was the greatest of the Greek city-states and the educator of the entire Hellenic world. The character of Pericles is a demonstration of the Anaxagorean philosophy. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Pericles was, as it were, the visible human incarnation of the building, moving, eliminating, ordering, reviewing, artistically undetermined force of the mind." End quote. Further in the same passage, Nietzsche continues, arguing that Pericles emulated the qualities of Anaxagoras when, quote, "As a public orator, he stood before his people, and the beautiful rigidity and immobility of a marble Olympian, and now, calm, wrapped in his mantle, with unruffled drapery, without any change of facial expression, without smile, with a voice the strong tone of which remained ever the same." End quote. Perhaps my favorite of Nietzsche's descriptions of Pericles is when Nietzsche writes that Pericles did not merely speak, but, quote, "thundered, struck with lightnings, annihilated and redeemed," end quote. And it is in this way that Pericles embodies the Anaxagorean chaos, a concept which we will examine in a moment. Anaxagoras' central idea can be approached in several ways, but one of its most significant points is that Anaxagoras conceives not of being, but of beings, plural. Hence, pluralism. It's an error in our thought, a false path to answer the question, what exists, by searching for one existent, rather than recognizing the obvious inductive truth, there are multiple existents. Anaxagoras therefore rejects the oneness of being that's put forward by Parmenides. He conceives not of the one, but of the all. One could say that the pure theory of being that characterizes Parmenides too is, in effect, the ultimate consequence of the monistic style of thought that had been followed by all of the Pre-Platonics up to this point. We start down this road by searching for one fundamental type of matter, the same road that Thales travels upon. But we end by asserting that there is literally only one thing, one being, one existence, the one. And the consequence of this is that we must say all of the other apparent phenomena are illusory. Anaxagorean philosophy rejects this monism as a fundamental flaw. The first major innovation of Anaxagoras can be seen in his response to Anaximander. For Anaximander, the fundamental being is qualityless. For Anaxagoras, the noumenon is not the absence of qualities, but asserted to be a mix of all qualities. This is the Anaxagorean chaos. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Anaxagoras conceives of the world's primal existence, perhaps as similar to a dust-like mass of infinitely small, concrete particles, of which every one is specifically simple and possesses one quality only, yet so arranged that every specific quality is represented in an infinite number of individual particles." End quote. The Anaxagorean chaos, importantly, does not reduce the many to the one, and furthermore, Anaxagoras posits the idea that the all is contained in the all, as he put it. The substances that make up one type of being, or one type of phenomena, are contained in the others. What we call becoming is a transformation of matter from one form into another, and Anaxagoras' intuition is based on what he can observe. Even apparently opposite qualities transform into one another. That which is hot becomes cold. White could be absorbed into black. In rock being worn away and eroded, the hard can become soft. In a newly sprouted plant growing into a towering tree, the soft can become hard. Minerals can be absorbed by the body and become flesh, and so on and so forth. These qualities are not themselves essential, but contain one another. In an important way, the so-called false path of Parmenides may have yielded at least some useful conclusion, insofar as Anaxagoras also rejects arising and passing away, in the sense meant by Anaximander and Heraclitus, that things literally come into being and then go out of being, or go from being to non-being. Becoming is redefined by Anaxagoras as an all, many existent things which through mixture and separation, which are his two main principles for describing the behavior of matter, through mixture and separation, the different phenomena combine, aggregate, dissolve, and disaggregate. Nietzsche writes, quote, "The older theory was that one element explains all things, that all qualities ultimately lead back to one quality, be it air or fire. On the other hand, Anaxagoras now maintains mixture and separation in accord with his theory. Through ever so much mixing together, something unlike can still be extracted from the like. The universe is full of different qualities. These exist, therefore they must be eternal. He perceives the actual world as true being. All its qualities must eternally exist. There are never more or less." End quote. So, rather than seeing one primal or fundamental type of being, one primordial state of being, such as water, we might say the moist, right? Or dampness, wetness. Rather than seeing heat or fire and all these other things as rarifications of water, just to compare the thought of Anaxagoras to Thales, he would say, well, clearly both heat and cold exist. They must both be within the primordial state of being, so to speak. They must both be eternal qualities. One is not a derivation or transformation of the other. All such qualities that we can identify must eternally exist. Still, the problem of motion remains. It has never been satisfactorily answered so far. Or rather, every attempt at answering it has relied on a previous metaphysical explanation, all of which elucidates some things but obscure others. For Anaxagoras to suggest that the fundamental mode of being is chaos, that the all contains the all, why does this transformation occur? Why does movement occur? Nietzsche puts the problem this way, quote, "The delicate question must be raised. If there are many substances, and if these many move, what moves them? Do they move one another? Or is it perhaps only gravitation? Or are there magic forces of attraction and repulsion within the things themselves? Or does the cause of motion lie outside these many real substances? Or putting the question more pointedly, if two things show a succession, a mutual change of position, does that originate from themselves? And is this to be explained mechanically or magically? Or if this should not be the case, is it a third something which moves them?" End quote. We could say that Anaximander answered this question moralistically. Movement, coming into being, is a kind of immoral theft from being. You could see movement as a kind of fault in the indefinite, but one which is inevitably corrected. We could conceive of it sort of like a vibration of things going into existence and then out again. Like a bow that you pluck, it vibrates, but that it returns to the center. It returns to that state of stasis. For Heraclitus, change is the logos. It's the law of the phenomenal world. It is simply the fundamental nature of reality to exist as strife and hence change. Therefore, it requires no explanation. It's simply a play of forces. For Parmenides, change is an illusion. He deals with the problem by saying there is no strife, there is no motion. Anaxagoras does not have recourse to such moralistic or magical explanations, or such thus-so explanations as Heraclitus. For Anaxagoras, the movement of the universe is the operation of what he calls nous. And this is a word that Nietzsche says is untranslatable, because it is a concept which is, quote, authentically Greek, end quote. It's usually translated as mind or intellect. Nietzsche suggests that nous indicates a direct sensation or an unmistakable apprehension. In Homer's Odyssey, for example, nous is the place where a character will say their anger is felt. So, for example, if we were to render nous as heart instead of mind, we might utter the phrase, "My anger wells in my heart, happiness springs in my heart. My anger wells in the nous, happiness springs in the nous." One knows their anger, their happiness through the nous. It's self-awareness of one's own emotional state. That's a kind of knowing, but it's a direct subjective sense of knowing, which is what Nietzsche emphasizes as the nous of Anaxagoras. It's mind in this sense to which Anaxagoras attributes the motion of the universe. It's not mind as a sort of deliberated, self-conscious reason, but something more akin to a direct sense. Nous could be compared to Spinoza's conatus or to Giordano Bruno's world soul. Bruno's explanation for the movement of the heavens was that the heavenly bodies have a divine spark in them, just like animate beings. Similarly, nous, quote, produces a circular motion or vortical movement on one point of mass, which immediately expands outward and pulls ever larger parts into its range, moving ever farther outward, end quote. The explanation for motion is thus not found in matter in itself, but in the nous which moves the matter according to this circular regularity. This underlying world will, we might call it, also bears similarity to the logos of Heraclitus, insofar as it is a form of order. For Nietzsche, quote, this is the important idea of Anaxagoras, that rotation suffices in order to explain all order and regularity in the universe. Only in this way does intellect affect order, or so says Aristotle, end quote. It's easy to see the way in which the Anaxagorian perspective could slide toward dualism, we might say, depending on whether one considers matter and nous to be two different substances. If one assents to that, then you would be in the camp of the Cartesian dualists. This is a sort of very old debate that has continued throughout the entire history of Europe. There's mind and there's matter, and people like Descartes said that they're both separable and ultimately have a different essence, and then people like Bruno and Spinoza said that fundamentally they were the same substance or essence, just simply in different attributes. Perhaps the remarkable thing about Anaxagoras is precisely how he establishes a kind of unity in the world of matter, in spite of the fact that he seems to be more among the camp of the Cartesian dualists, if we were to use apocryphal language to describe him. Anaxagoras says that the all is contained in the all, that these multiple existents, these multiple lumps of being, so to speak, are all the same fundamental nature as one another. They don't have to be permutations of some form or another of material. The laws and processes that govern the existence of one form of matter govern every form. All existents are material in nature. The nous is sort of like a disembodied law, so to speak. It is not itself another form of matter. Nietzsche writes, quote, those wholly isolated, thoroughly heterogeneous, and eternally unalterable substances were after all not conceived as being absolutely heterogeneous, but all had, in addition to a specific wholly peculiar quality, also one absolutely homogeneous substratum, a piece of space-filling matter. In their participation in matter, they all stood equal and therefore could act upon one another, i.e., knock against one another. Change did not in the least depend on the heterogeneity of those substances, but on their homogeneity as matter. End quote. At this point, even though I've said at the outset I didn't want to delve too deeply into Nietzsche's considerations regarding the Pre-Platonics from the standpoint of its significance to science and the Pre-Platonics as creators of a materialist worldview in ancient Greece, we can begin to see the outlines of the kind of materialist perspective that we'd probably associate with post-Enlightenment modernity, more so than with the ancient world, here in the philosophy of Anaxagoras. This natural philosophy of pluralism is that first step into the framework of atomism. Again, Nietzsche is not fully without his criticisms of Anaxagoras. His notion of the mind as nous, the driving force, still is somewhat a recourse to the inexplicable, at least insofar as Anaxagoras leans heavily on the fact that the power of the nous is arbitrary. The problem of motion as it comes to us when considering the Anaxagorian chaos is more than anything a problem of first causes, of putting to ourselves the question of why motion would begin in the first place, why transformation, change, strife would begin. And Nietzsche, for his part, describes Anaxagoras somewhat charitably, even as he acknowledges these rough edges in his thought. Nietzsche does so by reminding us that the Pre-Platonic philosopher was still a kind of artist. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Here, of course, one might ask, what fancy had at that time so suddenly occurred to the nous to knock against some chance material particle out of that number of particles, and to turn it around in whirling dance, and why that it did not occur to it earlier?" Whereupon Anaxagoras would answer, "The nous has the privilege of arbitrary action. It may begin at any chance time. It depends on itself, whereas everything else is determined from outside. It has no duty, and no end which it might be compelled to pursue. If it did once begin with that motion and set itself an end, this was, after all, only, the answer is difficult, Heraclitus would say, play." That seems always to have been the last solution or answer hovering on the lips of the Greek. The Anaxagorian mind is an artist, and in truth, the most powerful genius of mechanics and architecture, creating with the simplest means the most magnificent forms and tracts, and as it were a mobile architecture, but always out of that irrational arbitrariness which lies in the soul of the artist. It is as though Anaxagoras was pointing at Phidias, and in the face of the immense work of art, the cosmos, was calling out to us as he would do in front of the Parthenon. Becoming is no more, but only an artistic phenomenon. End quote. Empedocles, 484 to 424 BC. The definitive characteristic of Empedocles is his otherworldly arrogance, his assertion of his difference from every philosopher who has ever come before him. He considered himself a god incarnate, more than a mortal man. Nietzsche says that the driving force within Empedocles is jealousy as regards every other philosopher, and a desire to outrival them and become greater than all of them. In this respect, Empedocles is very Greek. He brings the agonistic competition into philosophy for the first time. Nietzsche says in his Pre-Platonic lectures, quote, "He comes from a family of competitors. He also actually achieves the greatest feat in Olympia." End quote. Empedocles was from Agrigentum, a Greek colony on the island of Sicily. The city had flourished for many decades, but a series of poor military decisions saw the city drawn into a number of losing conflicts, which resulted in the deaths of thousands of its citizens. Empedocles enters politics during this time of unrest, in which the government was reformed and became democratic. Before long, there were numerous attempts to install a tyranny, which Empedocles hated with a passion. He became a popular orator, extremely inflammatory in his rhetorical style, and because of his political prominence, Empedocles was able to completely reorganize the city government of Agrigentum. He dissolves the existing democratic body, the Assembly of the Thousand, quote, apparently because he had become suspicious of it, end quote. Empedocles is thus a democratic reformer first. He believes in the oneness of all souls and extrapolates this into a morality of universal love. The political consequence of this is a political order governed by equality. Nietzsche writes, quote, "He wins over the Agrigentines to equality in politics. Since he was so rich, He could provide dowries for the poorer maidens of the city. Apparently, he seeks a resolution to differences in wealth. He becomes so popular that he is offered the kingdom, which he declined." End quote. After this, he leaves Agrigentum. He gathers a band of followers who begin to regard Empedocles as a living god. He traveled from polis to polis, dressed in a purple robe, wearing a golden girdle and shoes of bronze. His hair was long, his head crowned with a Delphic laurel wreath. Wherever he went, he was followed by a procession of servants, and reportedly was met with throngs of people asking for oracles, seeking healing for their ailments. Empedocles, in his fragments, says, quote, "As I enter with these, men and women, into flourishing towns, I am reverenced, and tens of thousands follow, to learn where is the path which leads to welfare, some desirous of oracles, others suffering from all kinds of diseases, desiring to hear a message of healing." End quote. Empedocles seems to have actually believed himself to be divine. He writes, quote, "I go about among you, an immortal god, no more immortal, so honored of all, crowned with fillets and flower garlands." End quote. The people of Selinus worshipped him as though he were such a god, and he threw himself into Mount Etna to prove his divinity. Miracles are attributed to Empedocles, such as ending pestilences and joining rivers. Empedocles said that he found himself in this mortal realm as though he were a foreigner in the material world, exiled to a hostile land. His divine self-assurance is the basis of his philosophic teaching, and he also takes on the role now as a religious reformer. Nietzsche writes, quote, "He is the tragic philosopher, the contemporary of Aeschylus. The most unique thing about him is his extraordinary pessimism, which works on him actively, however not quietistically. His political views may be democratic, but the real fundamental idea is nonetheless to lead humanity across to the universal friendship of the Pythagoreans, and thus to social reform, with a dissolution of private property. He moves about as a wandering prophet after he failed to found the rule by all from love in Agrigentum." End quote. His thinking is both magical and scientific. Nietzsche argues that because, quote, "mythic and scientific thinking go hand in hand for him, understanding him is quite difficult." End quote. If the mythic and scientific are to be understood as two horses of very different natures, either of which one might mount to reach his goal, Empedocles, quote, "rides both steeds, jumping back and forth." End quote. He's undoubtedly a religious figure, but he does not teach mythically. Instead, he teaches allegorically. Nietzsche points out that he appropriates the names of deities, but not to invoke them as personalities. Instead, Empedocles uses the gods to signify forces or principles. Nietzsche writes, quote, "We especially note his interpretation of Apollo, whom he understood to be spirit, Geist." End quote. Empedocles, different as he is from Anaxagoras, also seeks for a kind of animating principle, rather than a fundamental form of being. For Empedocles, it is not nous, but love. Love is called by Empedocles by the names of Aphrodite, Harmonia, Philotes, or even just the Greek word for affection. But we must again recognize that a deity is here standing for a process rather than a personified understanding of metaphysics. Aphrodite is the concept of love itself. And we might further clarify, love is a principle synonymous with attraction. When we put it that way, Empedocles begins to seem a bit less mystical to the modern mind. Here is a man proposing a theory of attraction and repulsion. Love and hate, we might say harmony and strife, these are all just different ways of putting it. But attraction and repulsion are sort of the most clinical and scientific way of putting it. While Empedocles does not return to an anthropomorphized view of the cosmos, it's decidedly anthropocentric. His philosophy is centered on humanity, insofar as he believes that love and hate, which are human emotions, are the driving forces of nature. Human guilt is the cause of our existence within this world of strife. Existence is once again conceived as a punishment for past transgressions. Empedocles is counted among the pluralists because he's the innovator of the theory of the four elements, of which he says neither of the four is the fundamental monistic substance. The Empedoclean quaternity of the elements is the schema of four elements with which we're all familiar today: the fire of the sun, the ether, which is the sky, the water that makes up the oceans and falls to earth in the form of rain, the rocks and the soil of the earth itself. Empedocles argues these four have all existed eternally. They're not modifications of one more basic substance or one indefinite being. All four exist originally, and it is through love, attraction, that they exist in a sort of harmonious oneness, and hate, repulsion, they come into conflict and strife. And so life and the world and the beings within it are made up of all four of these elements in different combinations. But rather than seeing it in terms of mixture and separation, as Anaxagoras does, Empedocles, again, he thinks of it in terms of attraction and repulsion. We might say Anaxagoras seems to think in terms of chemistry, whereas Empedocles is thinking more in terms of a physics metaphor. Love as the driving principle seeks equality. It puts an end to strife. Inequality, imbalance, all of this is the cause of such strife. And so the love of Empedocles is just as otherworldly as the love of Christ in its way. Quote, "In this world of discord, of sorrow, of oppositions, he finds only one principle that guarantees an entirely different world order. He finds Aphrodite, known to all, but never as a cosmic principle." End quote. The fact that Empedocles sets love as a cosmic force against an antagonistic power, Nietzsche uses the term Macht, seems to have been influential in Nietzsche's thought. The equalizing desire of Aphrodite is set against the transformations and new births which occur through strife, brought about by genuine differences, unequal relationships of force. Quote, here he touches on Heraclitus' glorification of war as the father of all things. End quote. It is that very quest for harmony, the quest for equality, that drives Empedocles to uphold a metaphysical principle of this otherworldly love. And it's that same principle that prompts him to seek for an equal brotherhood amongst men. The oneness of all souls is the utmost principle for Empedocles, and it affects the way that he lives. For example, he does not eat meat. This is for much the same reason that some Buddhists don't eat meat. That animal could be your ancestor. The pig that you kill and eat might be the reincarnation of your grandfather, for all you know. There is a story that Empedocles once intervened to stop someone from beating a dog because he said that he heard in its yelps and wails that the dog was the soul of someone he knew. Nietzsche writes, quote, "He sought to impress the oneness of all life most urgently, that carnivorism is a sort of self-cannibalism, a murder of the nearest relative." End quote. Empedocles held his own principles above all of the religious prescriptions demanded by the rites. He once offered an ox made of honey and barley at the ritual sacrifice, as he was unwilling to slaughter a real one. This may be understood as something like heresy or impiety to other men, but for Empedocles, his divine self-assuredness allows him to make such a refusal in all good conscience. Empedocles is significant in the development of materialist thought because he recognizes the ambiguity in the concept of nous. Love and hate may seem more anthropocentric and metaphysical than such a concept as nous, but in his use of love and hate as the underlying principles, we get a more powerful descriptor of the operation of nature than saying it's all driven by mind. If we interpret the Empedoclean worldview as attraction and repulsion being the primary forces, desire and aversion in terms of organic life, this principle can be extrapolated into a theory that points in the direction of natural selection. And in fact, this is exactly what Empedocles does. Empedocles arrives at a view of organisms as having arisen via evolution, 2,000 years before Darwin. Empedocles sees the natural world as a struggle among the different forms of life to move from simplicity to complexity. This is spurred on by a constant struggle for existence between themselves. Schopenhauer saw Empedocles as the true originator of the theory of evolution because of this, and Schopenhauer takes a profound influence from Empedocles and how he thought about the development of the will's gradations. Organisms acting through attraction to what improves their health and repulsion away from that which harms their health, this model endures to this very day as a useful description of life. Thus we find that in three important respects, Empedocles anticipates modern thinking. First, Empedocles sees multiple modes or forms of matter, elements, as originally existing. We might say that this is not a wholly original innovation to him, but that he shares this attribute of his thought with Anaxagoras. But second, that he intuited the notion of speciation through a struggle for existence. Finally, that he most closely approximated the idea of physical laws as simply blind forces of nature. Among all those who had arisen thus far, especially if we compare Empedocles with his immediate predecessor Anaxagoras, it becomes rather clear he does not associate the underlying driving force of existence as something that could be construed as a conscious intelligence. Paradoxically, he achieves this by associating that force with a goddess rather than with mind, which sounds a little bit more abstract, but in so doing, the real aim of Empedocles is to present attraction and repulsion as the operative processes, instead of leaving open the ambiguities that might come with ascribing the movement of life to mind or intelligence. Of course, Nietzsche has criticism for this approach as well. He's keen to point out the problems or challenges that arise within this Empedoclean frame of mind. Nietzsche argues, quote, "Since the forces of love and strife may not be measured in any way, Empedocles really explains nothing at all." End quote. Of course, Empedocles did not strive for such precision, because that was not his style of thought. Love and hate are still decidedly metaphysical ideas, and Empedocles was decidedly not himself a materialist. Even so, this man who went around with the pretensions of being a literal god performing miracles still manages to advance the dialogue. He brings forth a picture of universal existence that we can in some way find a use for. He remains eternally difficult to understand because he was so many contradictory things all at once. Nietzsche argues, quote, "Empedocles continually stands on this boundary line, and in almost all matters, Empedocles is such a boundary line figure. He hovers between poet and rhetorician, between God and man, between scientific man and artist, between statesman and priest, between Pythagoras and Democritus. He is the motliest figure of older philosophy. He demarcates the age of myth, tragedy, and orgiastics, yet at the same time there appears in him the new Greek, as democratic statesman, orator, enlightenment figure, allegorist, and scientific human being. In him, the two time periods wrestle with each other. He is a man of competition through and through." End quote. We might see Empedocles, therefore, as similar to a figure like Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Nietzsche sees Empedocles as a man with two poles of the spirit, like Goethe had the two poles of the classical and the romantic. In Empedocles, we could classify it as the mystical and the scientific. He derives his greatness from that very tension, from a competition internal to himself between these two tendencies in thought. He contains the conflict between mind and body, matter and spirit, science and faith entirely within his own character. And yet, Empedocles still manages to offer us yet another single-minded worldview. The world governed by love. Democritus, 460 to 370 BC. Democritus is the last figure we shall consider among the Pre-Platonic philosophers. He was born a year before Socrates, so he cannot even rightly be called a pre-Socratic. He is more like a Socratic contemporary. He is the figure that completes the pluralist project in some sense, and that his philosophy puts forward an atomistic worldview. In Democritus, we find a view of the world governed by necessity rather than miracles. In this way, Democritus fulfills the long project of the natural philosophers up to this point. Democritus was either from Abdera or Miletus. He was known for having traveled widely. According to Clement of Alexandria, Democritus visited Babylon, Persia, and Egypt. He learned from the priests and the magi and sought out the most famous religious figures and intellectuals of his time in order to study under them. Democritus says, quote, "I am the most widely traveled man of all my contemporaries, and have pursued inquiries in the most distant places. I have visited more countries and climes than anyone else, and have listened to the teachings of more learned men. No one has surpassed me in the drawing of lines accompanied by demonstrations, not even the rope knotters of Egypt, with whom I passed 5 years on foreign soil." End quote. Nothing much is known of his life other than a mass of fables, as Nietzsche calls it. He may have studied under Empedocles. Other stories say that he learned from a Pythagorean. Many of us are familiar with the commonly ascribed character trait that Democritus was the philosopher who laughed. He's often compared or contrasted against Heraclitus, the philosopher who wept. As Nietzsche argues in his lecture, this association is of a much later origin and there's no basis for it. The philosophy of Democritus only exists in fragments and in the writing of others. Nietzsche argues that the Eleatics, led by Parmenides, derive their chief significance to us from the fact that Democritus attacks their central idea. Understanding Parmenides is important, most of all, because it helps us understand Democritus. Democritus works more or less in reverse from Parmenides. That is to say, he starts from an opposite axiom and affirms everything the Eleatics attempted to deny. Democritus begins from the reality of motion, rather than from the reality of quote-unquote being. Motion is readily observable. It is a phenomenon that we all have experience with, and it obtains in reality as we know it. If we begin by acknowledging this fact, the empirical reality of motion, then the metaphysical problems surrounding motion will very quickly appear to us not as problems with motion, but as problems with metaphysics. Even though this may be a rather obvious point to stress, Democritus argues, motion is real. This is the kind of attitude of Democritus that's perhaps as important as any other aspect of his thought, beginning from the affirmation of empirical reality, what is given to us by the senses, making our metaphysics answerable to that empirical reality instead of denying the reality of the senses in lieu of some search for abstract logical certainty. On account of this approach of Democritus, it might be easy to see why it was that figures such as Plato, who denied the senses, hated Democritus. Plato attempted to destroy every copy of Democritus's works that he could get his hands on. The Democritean attack against Parmenidean being presses a more fundamental point, however. It is really prior even to our empirical observation of external reality, the kind of objection that Democritus raises. Democritus sees the refutation of Parmenides simply by affirming mind as our direct experience. Nietzsche puts it this way, quote, "There exists a motion, since I think, and thought has reality," end quote. So not "I think, therefore I am," but "I think, therefore there is motion." The argument will go like this. Thought is moving. People begin from one thought, one idea about the world. For example, someone like, say, Parmenides I, who starts from an Anaximandrian perspective. And then people change their understanding. They move on to a new perspective about the world, such as the perspective of the pure theory of being put forward by Parmenides II. Parmenides' thought moved. Even he would be forced to admit this. He changed from thinking about reality one way, having one thought about reality, to having another thought about reality, and one that Parmenides considered to be the only correct idea about reality. He believed he had moved from thinking about the world falsely to thinking about it accurately. He had moved from false thought to true thought. If Parmenides is to deny the motion of his own thought, saying that thought is just as much of an illusion as the senses are, well, he's just called his pure theory of being an illusion. He said that thought was the only thing we should follow, not the senses, but the thought that only being is also an illusion. Parmenides' certainties can therefore be dispensed with because they cannot survive such a position. With this, the Parmenidean rejection of non-being is abolished by Democritus, who affirms non-being exists. Quote, with absolutely filled space, a plenum, motion is impossible. End quote. So if being is to indicate bodies in extended space, there must be emptiness between these bodies if they are to move and interact. As such, non-being is required for motion, and because motion is undoubtedly real, non-being must be regarded as just as real as being. Quote, motion demonstrates being as much as not being. If not being were to exist alone, there would be no motion. End quote. Democritus also continues along the Anaxagorian path in which matter is said to consist of different existence, different beings. But nevertheless, these are all unified, they are homogeneous, insofar as these existents are all material, they are all matter. They are the same in that they can affect one another as matter. Democritus takes this argument a step further, however, and conceives of the smallest possible unit of matter, positing that these units of matter would be indestructible, non-interpenetrating, and extended bodies. He called these smallest possible bodies atoms, and said that all matter was made up of their aggregation. Democritus argues that things come into being when the atoms coalesce together into a more complex form, they aggregate, and things pass away when the atoms disaggregate, when they dissolve. While Democritus affirms not being, or non-being, what he calls the void, or the space between matter, the void itself does not become being. Neither does being become the void. Material transformations occur, but the material does not actually arise or pass away. The atoms themselves are forever enduring, and the physical world is eternally existent. Perhaps the clumsiest aspect of the Democritean atomism is that Democritus posited the notion of atoms of spirit, or atoms of soul. He argued that all material atoms were suffused with such atoms of spirit. Material atoms could be modified, they could be made smoother, finer, spherical by the mechanical processes of the world, and the finest such atoms were atoms of fire. Democritus argues that these atoms have the greatest speed and ease of movement. It is these such fiery atoms that make up spirit. Spirit is therefore a modification of matter. This is the explanation for animate things, such as living beings, and this idea flows from the initial axiom that thought partakes of motion. Thought is the most freely moving aspect of existence. Nietzsche writes, quote, these fiery particles extend throughout the entire body. A spirited atom, seelan atom, is inserted between every two physical atoms. They are in continual motion. End quote. This aspect of Democritus' theory was criticized by Aristotle, and it's clear that Nietzsche has his own reservations about it. Perhaps the most charitable understanding of the spirited atom is found when we consider the goal of Democritus: to make consciousness a modification of matter, rather than setting up consciousness as a metaphysical principle which is prior to matter. Nietzsche thus had high praise for the Democritean philosophy. He wrote, quote, of all the more ancient systems, the Democritean is of the greatest consequence. The most rigorous necessity is presupposed in all things. There are no sudden or strange violations of nature's course. Now, for the first time, the collective anthropomorphic mythic view of the world has been overcome. Now, for the first time, do we have a rigorous, scientific, useful hypothesis. As such, materialism has always been of the greatest utility. It is the most down-to-earth point of view. It proceeds from real properties of matter. and it does not indifferently leave out the simplest forces, as is done by accounts of mind or that of final ends by Aristotle. It is a grand idea. This entire world of order and purposiveness, of countless qualities to be traced back to externalizations of one force of the most basic sort. Matter, moving itself according to general laws, produces a blind mechanistic result which appears to be the outline of a highest wisdom." End quote. And so, while Nietzsche said that the Eleatic view of the world is the least consequential, the worldview of Democritus is of the most consequence. It is the most useful for us modern thinkers to consider. His principle of movement can be seen as a sort of inchoate notion of something like gravitation. Democritus argues that as atoms coagulate and dissolve, heavier aggregations sink and lighter ones rise. Democritus follows the thought of Anaxagoras insofar as these multiple aggregations strike and collide with one another, and this strife is what produces transformations and changes in the physical world. But rather than nous, or love, Democritus suggests that the underlying principle is chance. Nietzsche takes issue with this kind of language, but he reinterprets Democritus in terms which will look familiar to anyone who has read Nietzsche's own philosophy. Quote, "The world is moved and arises out of, quote, chance, accidental colliding, concurso quodam fortuito. Blind chance rules among materialists. This is an entirely unphilosophical manner of speaking. We should instead call it purposeless causality, necessity without purposive intentions. Precisely here is there no chance whatsoever, but rather the most rigorous lawfulness, only not according to laws of reason. Well then, Democritus derives all motion from empty space and weight. Heavy atoms sink down and drive the smaller ones upward by pressure. The most primal motion of all, of course, is vertical, a steady, eternal fall into the infinity of space. Speed cannot be ascribed to them, since, given the infinity of space and the absolute steadiness of the fall, no relative standard for it exists at all." End quote. So whether one uses the term chance or necessity or non-purposive causality, what is significant for Nietzsche is the lack of intentions in the operative forces, the lack of teleology. Nietzsche's understanding of materialism is clarified here. A material understanding of reality, a true material understanding, has to be non-teleological. The world is not made for any goal or purpose, but acts according to patterns or processes, which are a form of necessity. Democritus is the final step in this direction of bringing forth this materialist worldview. And this fact is made clear insofar as his worldview is totally liberated from such teleological thinking. This is the final great leap of the Pre-Platonics, the leap from teleology, some reason or purpose for existence, to an existence which simply is and has no such purpose. Such a teleology was involved in every single explanation of reality up to that point, with the possible exception of Heraclitus, but Heraclitus, in his appeal to play, seems to lapse wholeheartedly into that idea of it's just random chance, whereas Nietzsche stresses this is anything but random. From the cosmogonies of the Orphics to the myths of the Olympians to the philosophy of Anaximander to the religious vision of Empedocles, there's always been this kind of telos, but not so with Democritus. And in some sense, we could say that in the course of this dialogue, the Pre-Platonics have discovered many of the major questions of epistemology. In Democritus, we see epistemology formulated as a discipline for the first time. Of particular interest to us will be Democritus's stance, his attempt at explaining why it is that we don't have direct sensation of these atoms, but without arguing that the truth of the senses is an illusion of some kind. Democritus does this by making a logical distinction between what he calls primary and secondary characteristics. Democritus and his school of atomists suggested that the qualities that past philosophers had taken to be objective aspects of reality were only qualities in our sensation of the objects. things like heat and cold, and dampness and brightness, and so on. For Democritus, the independent characteristics of the object in itself, so to speak, were its primary characteristics, such as the qualities of the object's atoms, the things that make it up, the matter. The atoms that make up the object are eternal, indivisible, extended, corpuscular, non-interpenetrating, and so on. These are the primary characteristics. The secondary characteristics are the qualities, things such as moist, dry, hot, cold, solid, liquid, and so on. These are all relative. They're represented to the conscious mind according to its own powers of conception. Reality is not directly experienced by the conscious mind, but only reality's image, shaped by the one perceiving it. This is another huge leap of Democritus, and that all of these qualities had always been assumed to have some essential nature or existence. They had all been variously used as a driving force of nature, such as Anaximander sourcing the creation of existent phenomena to the interaction between warmth and cold. But here, warmth and cold are understood as sensations, something which we perceive with our nervous system. They are therefore relative, not something absolute or essential to the object, but indicative of our experience of it and no more than that. Nietzsche writes, quote, "We have here the distinction that returns with the English philosopher John Locke. Primary characteristics which the thing in itself receives apart from our representations, such that we cannot think of it separated from extension, impenetrability, shape, and number. Everything else is secondary, the product of these primary characteristics' operations on the organs of sensation. The mere sensation of these, followed by color, sound, taste, smell, solidity, smoothness, flatness, roughness, and so on. The creativity of things is also what accounts for the action of the nerves of the sense organs." End quote. Democritus says that like is only sensed by like. What he means by this is that our sense organs were developed in accordance with the strength of the corresponding sense impression that they're designed to sense. Our experience of the world is a representation because we don't perceive the object directly. Rather, quote, "visible things emit effluences that bear their shapes, and the eye reflects them," end quote. In other words, visual things leave a sort of mark, an image that's carried on the air around them. The object itself never touches the eye, only the air that carries its image. Quote, "What touches this itself, the eye, is only the air that moves from these images and is made into an impression of them," end quote. And therefore, the representation of the object is a creation just as much of our visual sense organ, the thing that is alike to these visual effluences, and the eye then produces its own effluences that, quote, "modify the image," end quote. So with Democritus, we're faced with a philosopher whose importance to Nietzsche's thought really can't be understated, even though Nietzsche almost never mentions him in his published work. Democritus influences Nietzsche on several key points. First, that mind is a modification of matter. Second, that there is no immaculate perception of the objective world, that all perception is perspectival because we're only perceiving the secondary qualities. And finally, that there is no teleology to the world. The world acts according to non-purposive forces. All of this is reflected in the thought of Nietzsche. Democritus and his atomistic school stand apart from the rest of the Greek world when we consider the sheer sobriety and clear-headedness of their doctrine. It is the materialist worldview that is, in Nietzsche's words, quote, "precisely our world, in whose production we are constantly engaged," end quote. How then are we to attempt to sum up these Pre-Platonics, these philosophers of the tragic age of the Greeks, who dared to philosophize in spite of all of its dangers? If they are to be understood as physicians to the Greek culture, as those who fostered the health of a culture by cultivating the power of reason to render an image of the world, how are we to explain what comes after these Pre-Platonics? That is to say, Socrates, Plato, the moralistic, theoretical, anti-life view of the world, as Nietzsche classifies it. The view that denies the senses, that lives in idealism, that seeks to bring forth utopias, condemns everything irrational and artistic according to the standards of its reason. Nietzsche saw Socrates and Plato as, if anything, anti-Greek, and we cannot deny they are the next step in this process. Perhaps these kinds of troubling questions might have been one factor that pushed Nietzsche not to finish this essay, since it is difficult to say what conclusion we ought to draw about pre-Platonic philosophy here at its ending, brilliant and important though Democritus was. What came forth after him was the good, the theory of the forms, the moralistic interpretation of the world as supreme. Well, if I was to speculate about what Nietzsche would have written about this had he concluded his essay, we might begin by pointing out the antipathy of Plato toward Democritus. We might also consider the ways in which the pre-Platonics have been generally dismissed or treated as, at best, a mere prelude to Socrates, when in fact Socrates and Plato seemingly turned the spirit of the pre-Platonics on its head. The significance of the pre-Platonic philosophy might be recognized in the difference between the artful, leaping style of these single-minded sages and the style of Plato, the slow, ponderous, systematizing style. And if we are to admit that Parmenides anticipated the coming of Plato, it should only be with the caveat that Plato borrowed from him, pilfered from him, worked his ideas into a broader system which ultimately rejected Parmenides' entire project. Perhaps another observation might be that the symptoms manifest in Greek philosophy mirror the physiological reality of Greece's decline, that the tendencies in Greek philosophy that eventually blossom into Platonism are tendencies that existed in Greek society already, as a consequence of what we would call decline or decadence. These symptoms emerge in philosophy because they are symptoms, not causes. Seen from that angle, the history of pre-Platonic thought appears as the transition from what Nietzsche called the tragic to the period he called the theoretic. This roughly corresponds with the ascension of Macedon over the Greek world and the rise of Alexandrian Greece. After Alexander, the Greek intellectual world became less creative in Nietzsche's view. It became more concerned with cataloging and categorizing what had come before. Many of its great figures were scientists, historians, authors of encyclopedias. Its dramatic forms were very meta, so to speak, making references and allusions to the great works that were written centuries beforehand. In other words, at the centuries at the end of the Greek world's life, its thought and its art became derivative. Its focus came to be system building, arranging, ranking, organizing. And so, if we return to Nietzsche's remarks at the beginning of Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, he says that while the Greeks began philosophizing at the right time, they certainly did not know when to stop. They didn't end at the right time. Their philosophy ventured headlong into the clouds of abstraction and separated entirely from the natural world. And this was the greatest sign of their decline. The philosophers who existed before that time, before the time of abstraction and systematization, offer us a window into a creative philosophy. And that's Nietzsche's main emphasis throughout the text, that each of these figures had to create philosophy for himself. It didn't exist as an established discipline with established schools, and even at the tail end of this period, when something approximating those things had come into being, the most remarkable figures are these men who appear with a single-minded tyrannical thought about reality, an artistic thought about reality. They are self-legislators. They create the world out of their own reason and dare to put themselves into contradiction with the pre-established explanations. These cosmogonies, which were naive and allegorical and mythological and taken for granted. They see fit to attack these pre-established viewpoints, much like Nietzsche's lion in his parable of the camel, lion, and child, so that they can remake the world anew and become the creative child. The thinkers of the Alexandrian world, by contrast, are more like camels. They pick up all of these previous ideas and carry them off on their backs. Perhaps, then, we could see these philosophers of the tragic age as an inspiration to Nietzsche, first and foremost, because of their common act of world authoring. If there is one descriptor that seems to be applied to these men of such diverse character and background, pride is perhaps the most common term that Nietzsche uses. Each of them obtains their pride in a different way, expresses their pride in a different way, understands their pride in a different way. But all have the underlying faith and their own reason that allows them to say that what is commonly said and believed is ignorant and false. Let me present you with another truth, another world which has been entirely derived from my own wisdom. Let me entice you and invite you to live in my new world. Arguably, Nietzsche does this with his world as will to power. It is another image of the natural world as ruled by the most rigorous necessity, but one which is absent of any teleology. It's a world which Nietzsche fashions out of his own wisdom in opposition to the ignorance of the great many, a world which he shows to us out of his own mirror, his own self-legislation, and remaking of reality. In that way, his entire philosophy carries on the tradition of those tragic philosophers, who were for Nietzsche an enduring source of fascination. Thank you for joining me, everyone. I hope you've had as much fun as I have on this journey through the thought of these single-minded sages, as Nietzsche calls them. Let me know in the comments which pre-Platonic or pre-Socratic or whatever you want to call them is your favorite. It's hard for me not to say Heraclitus, but for my part, I really like Anaxagoras and even Empedocles, in spite of how differently I think from Empedocles, because he's just such an unusual figure, and the descriptions of him and his cult of followers just make him a bit larger than life. I like that it's not easy to categorize him also. So those are two of my favorites, aside from Heraclitus, which is the obvious answer. But again, let me know who your favorites are. That's all for this week, everyone. See you next time. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche Podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.